The clock on the parlor wall has been silent for 3 days. Edward is 5 years old, and this bothers him more than anything has ever bothered him in his short life. Not the silence itself, but the fact that no one in the house seems to care. His father walks past it every morning without looking up. The housemaid dusts around it. Everyone has simply accepted that the clock is broken, the way people accept rain. Edward cannot accept it. He drags a chair from the dining room, climbs up and lifts the clock off its hook. It is heavier than he expected. He carries it to the kitchen table with both arms, sets it down carefully and opens the glass face. Then the back panel. He stares at what's inside for a long time. The wheels, the springs, the small teeth of the gears meshing into each other like a tiny metal city. He does not touch anything yet. He just looks. Then one piece at a time, he takes it apart. His mother Margaret finds him 40 minutes later, surrounded by every component of the clock laid out in a perfect row on the kitchen table, largest to smallest, left to right. She stands in the doorway and does not say a word. She watches. Edward picks up the first gear, fits it against the second, feels the teeth catch and begins to put it back together. When he hangs the clock back on the wall, it ticks. His father William comes in from the stables that evening, smells of horses and leather and the particular dust of the road. He stops in front of the clock, listens to it tick, looks at Edward sitting at the dinner table, says nothing. But for just a moment, one corner of his mouth moves. His mother puts an extra piece of bread on Edward's plate. The world is safe. The world makes sense. The world is full of things that can be understood if you look at them long enough. 5 years later, Edward finds a broken steam pump on the trash heap behind the east stable. Someone threw it out. Cracked housing, seized piston, one valve missing entirely. To everyone else, it is junk. To Edward, it is a project. He carries it to the small corner of the woodshed that he has quietly claimed as his own. 3 shelves of salvaged parts, 2 bent screwdrivers, a file he found in the mud, a hand drill he traded for by fixing a stable boy's boot buckle. He spends 4 evenings taking the pump apart. On the 5th evening, he understands what is wrong with it. On the 6th, he fixes it. On the 7th, he bolts it to the side of the main water trough and rigs a leather belt drive off the wheel mechanism of an old clock. Not the parlor clock, a broken pocket watch he found in the road. When he cranks the handle, water flows into the trough by itself. No buckets, no hauling. The stable hands stand around it and laugh with delight. Old Curtis, who has been hauling water at Danforth Stables for 19 years, puts his hands on his hips and says, "Boy, you just saved me 2 hours a day." His father appears at the stable door, looks at the pump, looks at Edward, then says flat and final, "Go help with the horses." Edward goes. But that night, before he sleeps, he opens his notebook and sketches 3 improvements to the pump. The belt drive could be tighter, the valve housing could be rebored to stop the slow leak at the seal. If you added a second cylinder, his mother comes in to say goodnight. She sees the notebook. She does not tell him to put it away. She sits on the edge of his bed and looks at the drawing for a moment. Then she goes to her room and comes back with a new notebook. Larger, with better paper, the kind she uses for household accounts. She sets it on his desk without a word and kisses him on the forehead. Edward does not thank her. He is already drawing. The cough starts in autumn. It is small at first, a sound Margaret makes in the mornings, like she is clearing her throat. Then it is there at dinner. Then at night, through the wall when the house is quiet, and every sound carries. Edward is 9 years old and he understands more than people think he understands. He builds her a ventilation mechanism for her bedroom. It takes him 3 weeks. Wooden frame, copper tubing salvaged from a broken lamp, a belt drive from the gears of a broken clock. Always clocks, always gears. When the mechanism runs, it pulls fresh air from outside through a series of baffles and pushes stale air out through the top of the window frame. He read about something like it in an old engineering pamphlet he found in the library discard pile. He modified it, made it smaller, made it work. He installs it on a Saturday while his mother is resting downstairs. When she comes back to her room and sees it turning slowly in the corner, making its small rhythmic sound, she stands in the doorway for a long moment. Then she sits down on the bed and holds her hands together in her lap and says, "Edward, that is all, just his name. The mechanism runs for 6 months. The cough does not get better." Margaret Danforth dies on a Tuesday in March, when the ice on the road outside is just beginning to soften. Edward is 10 years old. He stands at the graveside in his good coat and does not cry, because he does not understand yet how to cry for something this large. He looks at the mechanism still turning in the corner of her empty room when they get home, belt looping around its wooden wheel, pulling air that now goes nowhere, and he leaves it running. He does not touch it for a year. Virginia arrives on a Sunday 11 months later. She is tall, red-haired, and smells of expensive perfume. She shakes Edward's hand at the front door like he is a business associate, not a child, and her eyes measure him in the same half-second she measures the foyer. She is a widow from Philadelphia. Her first husband was a banker. She is not here because she loves William Danforth. Edward knows this the way he knows when a gear is the wrong size, not from being told but from looking at how the parts fit. Virginia does not hate him openly. She is too precise for that. It is smaller things. "Edward, you're covered in grease again. Is that how children from good families behave?" said lightly, almost pleasantly at the dinner table in front of guests. His workbench in the woodshed, which has been his private corner for 3 years, is declared a fire hazard and padlocked. His books are moved from the parlor shelves to a box in the attic because they clutter the room. When he asks his father about it, William Danforth looks tired and says he'll sort it out. He never sorts it out. His father is a man who needs peace the way horses need water. Virginia gives him peace. Edward, who is loud in the head even when quiet in the body, does not give him peace. The lock stays on the woodshed. Charles William Danforth is born in the spring of 1864, when Edward is 12. He is red-haired like his mother, square-jawed like his father, healthy and loud, and exactly what everyone in the house has been waiting for without saying so. Edward stands in the hallway outside the nursery and listens to the baby cry and understands, with the same cold clarity he brings to broken mechanisms, exactly what has just changed. Dinner from that week forward is about Charles. The morning tours of the stables are about Charles. Look how he sits in the saddle. Look how he handles the reins, already a Danforth. The business talks between William and the managers drift toward the future in ways that no longer include Edward's name, when Charles is old enough, when Charles takes over. Edward sits at the far end of the table and eats his food and draws gear diagrams in the margin of his napkin. He is not angry, not yet. He is cataloging. His father's heart starts failing when Edward is 19. Virginia does not let him visit. William is resting. William is not receiving. 3 weeks of this, then 4, Edward stops asking permission. One morning he walks past the housekeeper, past the landing, and opens the bedroom door. William Danforth is yellow, sunken. He looks like a sketch of himself made by someone who only half remembered what he looked like. His eyes find Edward slowly, like a lantern being turned up from almost nothing. There's a long silence. Then his father says quietly, not looking away, "You were always smarter than me, Edward. I suppose that never counted for much." Edward stands at the foot of the bed. He wants to say 100 things. He says nothing. He nods once and leaves. William Danforth dies 31 days later. The will is read on a Wednesday. 16 stables, all contracts, all properties, all horses, all accounts. To Charles with Virginia as guardian. To Edward, nothing. Not $1. Not one horse. Not the pocket watch his father carried for 20 years. Virginia comes to his room that evening. She does not knock. She opens the door and stands in the frame and says, "Pack your things. I want you out by morning." Behind her at the end of the hall, Charles, 8 years old, red-haired and square-jawed and already learning how to stand the way his mother stands, weight back, chin level, looking down a little. She has been teaching him to do that, teaching him who to look at that way. Edward packs 1 suitcase, his good coat, his working clothes, 3 books he will not leave behind, his notebooks, his rolled drawings bound with string, and from the desk drawer the photograph of his mother, silver frame, slightly tarnished, her eyes looking somewhere past the camera at something she found interesting. He closes the suitcase, picks it up, walks downstairs and out the front door. On the porch, he stops. Virginia is standing behind him, Charles behind her. Edward does not turn around. He speaks to the dark street, to the road, to the city beyond it. "You'll regret this, and my name will be heard from every corner of this country." Virginia makes a small sound, not quite a laugh, dismissal made audible. Edward walks down the porch steps and onto the road. His shoes find the packed dirt and he moves forward, and he does not look back, not once. Not at the house, or the stables, or the lit windows, or the life that is just closed behind him like a gear that no longer fits the wheel. He walks. He has $4.30, a suitcase, and the complete internal architecture of a combustion engine inside his head. It is enough to start. The room above the laundry costs $3 a month. Edward pays the first week with the last of his money and is in debt by the second. The room is 6 feet wide and 8 feet long. One window that faces a brick wall. An iron cot with a mattress that smells of someone else's life. A small table, a hook on the back of the door. That is everything. He lies on the cot the first night and stares at the ceiling and does the arithmetic. $4.30. Rent due in 3 weeks. No tools, no materials, no workshop. He has the drawings in his tube. 41 pages of engine schematics he has been developing in notebooks since he was 14. And he has his hands. Hands need tools. Tools need money. Money needs work. In the morning he finds Harrigan's. The sign says Harrigan and Son, repair of all things. The Son has been partially scratched out, which tells Edward something about the Son. The shop sits on a narrow street 3 blocks from the river, wedged between a coal merchant and a dead barber. In the window, a broken clock, a bent plow blade, a copper kettle with a hole in the bottom, and a sign that says open in a handwriting that suggests the owner wrote it when he had better eyesight. Cornelius Harrigan is 63 years old, Irish, red-nosed, and has the hands of a man who has been doing precise work for 40 years. Thick fingers that move with an accuracy that has nothing to do with their size. He looks at Edward for approximately 4 seconds when Edward walks in. "You want work?" "Yes." "Can you fix things?" "Yes." "What kind of things? Anything with moving parts?" Harrigan picks up the copper kettle from the window and holds it out. "Fix that." Edward looks at the hole. It is not a clean puncture. The copper around it has been stressed and thinned from the inside, probably from boiling dry repeatedly. A patch will hold for a week. The real fix is to anneal the metal around the hole before patching, so it stops spreading. He says this. Harrigan sets the kettle down. $1 a day, dinner. You use my tools after 6 in the evening. You fix whatever comes in after hours for free. We split nothing. What you earn is yours. What I earn is mine. Touch anything in the back cabinet without asking and you're out. Yes, Edward says. He starts that morning. Harrigan's shop is a gravitational center for broken things. Farmers bring seized axle hubs. Hotels bring clockwork mechanisms from dining room displays. The railroad sends over small auxiliary parts that the main depot workshop is too backed up to handle. A woman brings in a music box every 3 months, always broken in a slightly different way. Always asking Harrigan to fix it. Always paying in eggs. Edward watches. This is the part of his education that no book has given him. The physical grammar of metal. How a file cuts differently across the grain than with it. How to feel through the handle of a wrench. Whether a bolt is about to how heat changes what a piece of steel will do. The exact color of the metal at the exact temperature where it will bend cleanly instead of cracking. Harrigan does not teach him these things. Harrigan just works. And Edward watches, and the knowledge moves from the old man's hands into Edward's head like water finding level. By the 3rd week, Harrigan lets him handle the lathe. By the 6th week, Harrigan stops checking his work. By the 2nd month, Edward is fixing the after-hours jobs faster than the daytime ones. He finishes Harrigan's backlog. He has $14 saved in his boot, and the beginning of a plan. The gas company starts replacing the main line on Monroe Street on a Monday. Edward sees the crew when he walks to work. Old cast iron pipes stacked on the sidewalk, lengths of it, waiting for the scrap collector who is supposed to come Thursday. He walks past it in the morning. He measures it with his eyes, the diameter, the wall thickness, the length of the useful sections. He measures it again on the way home. Tuesday morning, 5 o'clock, still dark. He is at the pile before the street cleaners, before the delivery carts, before anyone. He walks the length of the stack methodically, turning pieces, reading the condition of the metal. He needs one specific section, inside diameter of approximately 3 inches, wall thick enough to handle compression, no cracks in the casting. He finds it in the 4th to last piece. 4 feet long, heavy enough that carrying it 12 blocks takes 40 minutes and leaves his arms shaking. He sets it on the table in his room. It is, in his estimation, the most important piece of pipe in Detroit. He works on the cylinder for 3 evenings after Harrigan locks up. The lathe does the rough bore, then the file, a flat bastard file, then a half round, then a needle file for the final pass. He is cutting by feel and candlelight, checking the bore with a caliper he borrowed from the back shelf and will return before Harrigan notices. The target, a bore smooth enough that a machined piston will slide without a gap you can feel with your fingernail. First evening, rough bore, complete. Hands blistered across the middle, 3 fingers of his right hand. Second evening, intermediate passes. The blisters open, he wraps his fingers in cloth and keeps working. Third evening, final bore. He slides a test piece in, smooth, even resistance along the full length. No wobble. He holds the cylinder up to the candle and looks down the bore the way a rifleman looks down a barrel. It will work. The piston takes 1 evening on the lathe, after Harrigan leaves. He works by the light of 1 candle set on the corner of the lathe bed, which is not enough light, and is also a fire risk, both of which he is aware of and ignoring. The piston has to fit the cylinder with a clearance of less than half a hair's width, tight enough to hold compression, loose enough not to seize when the metal expands from heat. He cuts it in 3 passes, checking fit after each one, walking the piston to the room and sliding it into the cylinder and feeling how it moves. Third pass. It slides, resistance like a well-fitted drawer. He stands in Harrigan's dark shop and exhales. The valves come from the railroad depot scrapyard on Gratiot Avenue, and the scrapyard guard is a problem. First visit, Edward walks up to the fence and explains that he would like to look through the copper scrap. The guard tells him to go away. He goes away. Second visit, he tries the other gate, the one on the side street. Different guard, but this one has apparently been told about the first visit. He goes away again. Third visit, he brings a bottle of rye whiskey, the cheap kind which costs him 40 cents and represents almost 3 days of savings. He hands it through the fence without explanation. The guard looks at it, looks at Edward, looks back at the bottle. 20 minutes, the guard says. Don't take anything big. Edward takes 11 minutes. He comes back through the fence with a cloth sack containing 4 copper plates of varying thickness, 2 bent pipe couplings that can be straightened, and a small block of brass that has no obvious purpose but whose alloy he wants to examine. Total weight, 4 pounds. Total cost, 40 cents. And the knowledge that he can be flexible when flexibility is required. The valves take 4 evenings to cut, shape, fit, and seat. 2 of them he makes twice. The first version of the intake valve seals unevenly. He can feel the leak with his fingertip when he pressurizes the test assembly with his breath. He makes it again. The second version seals clean. The springs come from a wrecked delivery wagon abandoned on the east side of Woodward Avenue. It has been there for 2 weeks. The owner either fled a debt or met a worse fate, neither of which is Edward's business. The leaf springs on the rear axle are exactly the material he needs. High carbon steel, already heat-treated, already proven to handle repeated stress. He comes back after dark with a chisel and a hammer borrowed from Harrigan's. It starts raining at the halfway point. He keeps working. By the time he has the springs free and folded into his bag, his coat is soaked through, and the street is running with brown water. He walks home anyway. The ignition spark plug is the part that takes the longest. He builds 3 versions. The first, a piece of stoneware from a broken jug, drilled through with a small bore, steel needle threaded through the center, gap set by eye. He tests it by running current from the room's single electrical fixture, one terminal to the needle, the other grounded to the cylinder body. The spark is there but weak, not enough to fire a fuel charge reliably. Second version, finer needle, tighter gap, better stoneware from a broken laboratory insulator he finds in the trash behind a dentist's office. Better spark, still inconsistent. Third version, he changes the geometry of the gap, angles the needle slightly, rather than running it straight through. The spark jumps farther and hotter. He tests it 30 times, it fires 29. The one miss is a contact problem, not a design problem. He fixes the contact. The plug is done. He assembles the engine on a Sunday when Harrigan's is closed and his landlady is at church. It takes 4 hours. Cylinder mounted to a wooden base he built from shipping crate lumber. Piston fitted, connecting rod bent from a steel rod he bought for 8 cents at the hardware on Cass Avenue. Crankshaft, the most complex piece, machined from a solid bar over 3 evenings, balanced by hand and by feel. Valves seated and sprung. Ignition wire run from the ceiling lamp fixture down to the plug. Junction soldered with lead and resin. He fills the fuel cup with kerosene, sets a small glass of water on the shelf above the sink, checks every connection once, then again. First attempt, he cranks the flywheel by hand and releases. Nothing. The plug fires, he can see the spark, but the fuel mixture is too lean. He adjusts the intake valve, opens it a fraction more. Second attempt, he cranks and releases. The cylinder fires, once. Hard, like a fist hitting the table. The engine bucks against its wooden base, throws a spray of oil across the sink, fills the room with a blue-white haze of burning kerosene. He gets the window open and waits for the smoke to clear. He adjusts the exhaust valve timing, tightens one bolt on the crankshaft bearing that has vibrated slightly loose, checks the ignition contact. Third attempt, he cranks the flywheel, releases, the engine catches and runs. Not one pulse, not a series of bangs. It runs a continuous low, even roar that makes the wooden base rattle against the sink and the glass on the shelf walk 2 inches to the left before falling and shattering on the floor. The sound fills the small room completely. Edward stands with his hand still on the flywheel and feels the vibration moving up through the floorboards into the soles of his feet. His hands are shaking. Not from effort, from something else. Something he has no word for yet. He shuts the engine down after 60 seconds because the room is filling with exhaust, and the landlady will be back from church within the hour. He is sitting on the edge of the cot when he hears, through the thin wall, Mrs. Callahan talking to someone in the hallway below, her neighbor, from the sound of it. Danforth? Yes, the one on the second floor. You know the Danforth stables? The big ones? A murmur from the neighbor. Apparently they threw him out. No inheritance, nothing. Couldn't even keep him in the family. A pause. Strange boy from what I can tell. Up at all hours making God knows what noise. Honestly, with boys like that you can understand why. Footsteps on the stairs. A door closing. Edward looks at the engine sitting on his kitchen sink. Still warm, faintly ticking as the metal cools. He does the arithmetic out loud, quietly, to no one. Engine, done. Frame, none. Wheels, none. Money, $4.30. He counts the days on his fingers. 18 days to the end of the month. He picks up his notebook, opens it to a fresh page, starts drawing the frame. The engine runs. That is the easy part. What Edward needs now is something for it to move. He spends 3 evenings doing the calculations. Frame weight, wheel diameter, gear ratio between the crankshaft and the rear axle, load capacity for a single rider. The numbers are not complicated. They are mechanical arithmetic, the kind he has been doing in notebook margins since he was 12. What is complicated is the money. A machined steel frame, custom built, $40 minimum, 4 pneumatic wheels with iron rims, $22, axles, bearings, steering linkage, another $15. He has $4.30. The gap between what he has and what he needs is not a gap. It is a canyon. He walks the neighborhood instead. Not aimlessly, he is looking at every workshop, every yard, every alley behind every building, reading the commercial landscape the way he reads a broken mechanism. What does this block need that it is not getting? And on the second morning, walking past the carriage works on Larn Street, he finds his answer. The sign reads Brandt Carriage Works, fine vehicles since 1861. In the window, a light 2-seat phaeton in dark green lacquer brass fittings, spoke wheels with red striping. In the yard visible through the gate, 4 half-finished carriage bodies on sawhorses, and on the workbench beside the open door, a heap of tools in a state that tells Edward everything he needs to know. Bent spanner handles, a brace with a cracked chuck, files worn past usefulness, a hand plane with a blade so far out of true that it would leave ridges in soft pine, a workshop that has been too busy to maintain its own instruments. He knocks on the door frame. Friedrich Brandt is 60, German-born, with a gray mustache of the variety that suggests strong opinions about everything. He is fitting a wheel hub when Edward walks in and he does not look up. Not hiring. I'm not looking for work, Edward says. I'm looking for a trade. Brandt looks up. Edward lays it out plainly. He will repair every tool in the workshop, all of them, working evenings after his day at Harrigan's without payment. In exchange, Brandt will provide 1 carriage frame, 4 wheels with iron rims, a front axle assembly, rear axle, and a set of leaf springs, all at material cost only, no labor markup. Edward will pay the material cost over 90 days. Brant stares at him for a long moment. His eyes go to the heap of tools on the bench, then back to Edward, with the expression of a man who is being offered something he wants, but is professionally obligated to distrust. "What do you need a frame for?" Brant asks. "You don't look like a man buying a carriage." "I'm not buying a carriage. I'm building something else. The frame is the base. Something else." Brant says this the way a man says it, when he has already decided the answer is either stupid or insane, and is waiting to find out which. "A frame without a horse, yes. You're mad." "Probably. Do we have a deal?" Brant looks at his tools again. The cracked brace, chuck, the plane blade, the 3 files that need recutting. He has a commission due in 6 weeks, and he has been doing everything slightly wrong, because his instruments are slightly wrong, and he knows it and has been ignoring it because there is no time. 90 days on the materials, Brant says. Not a day more. 90 days, Edward agrees. He starts on the tools that evening. It takes him 4 weeks of evenings to work through Brant's workshop. He fixes 11 hand tools, recuts 4 files on Harrigan's grinding wheel, replaces the chuck on the brace with a spare he machines himself from a hexagonal steel blank, rebeds the plane blade and reflattens the sole on a surface plate. He does not rush. Bad tool repair is worse than no tool repair. A blade set wrong will ruin work for years before anyone traces the fault back to the fix. He does each one until it is right. Brant watches him work for the first 2 evenings without comment. On the 3rd evening, he brings 2 cups of coffee without being asked, and sets one on the bench next to Edward, and goes back to his own work without a word. Edward takes this as the highest possible form of German professional approval. By the time the tools are done, the frame, wheels, and axles are waiting for him in the corner of Brant's yard, covered with a canvas sheet. Material cost, $14, payable over 90 days. He shakes Brant's hand, loads the components onto a borrowed handcart, and wheels them 3 blocks to the shed behind the laundry that he has rented from the building's owner for $2 a month on top of his room. Money he does not technically have yet, running on the arithmetic of future earnings and the assumption that things will work. The shed is 12 feet by 14 feet, with a dirt floor and enough light from one window to work by in the afternoon. He moves the engine from his room to the shed on a Sunday, in pieces, 3 trips up and down the narrow stairs, the crankshaft under one arm and the cylinder under the other. Assembly takes 2 months. Not because the work is slow, because he is doing it correctly, which means doing it 3 times, when twice would be almost good enough and once would be structurally sufficient but philosophically wrong. The frame is a standard light carriage frame, 2 parallel steel rails connected by cross members, designed to carry a body, and 2 passengers behind a horse. Edward cuts it down by 18 inches in the front, removes the tongue socket entirely, fabricates a new front cross member that carries the steering linkage. The steering linkage itself is a length of water pipe bent to a T-shape at the top. Crude, functional, the kind of solution that will embarrass him in 5 years. But it will work now, and that is what matters now. The engine mounts to the frame on 4 rubber and steel isolators he makes from salvaged door bumper material, and machined steel cups, which reduces the vibration transferred to the frame by approximately half, and means the whole machine doesn't try to shake itself apart at speed. The rear axle carries a sprocket he cuts from a plate of mild steel on Harrigan's metal saw, and files to final shape by hand. The bicycle chain he buys for $1 from a junk dealer on Gray Shit. It is 2 chains riveted together to double the width and therefore the load capacity. Because a single bicycle chain on this application will last approximately 40 minutes before it stretches and skips. Fuel tank is a 2-gallon kerosene can fitted with a petcock valve and a copper tube running down to the intake manifold. Seat is a plank of oak, 1 inch thick, with 2 inches of horsehair padding he pulls from a ruined carriage cushion in Brant's scrap pile, tacked down with copper tacks. Footboards are pine. No roof, no sides, no weather protection of any kind. It looks, when he stands back and looks at it honestly, like a carriage that has been partly disassembled by someone who ran out of time and replaced the missing pieces with whatever was nearest. It is the most beautiful thing Edward has ever seen. He runs the first static test on a Tuesday evening in late February. Engine running, rear wheels turning, machine held stationary by a wooden chock under the front axle. The chain runs, the sprocket turns, the rear axle spins. He checks the temperature of the engine bearings after 10 minutes, checks the chain tension, checks the fuel flow, everything within acceptable range. He shuts it down and writes 6 pages of notes. The road test happens on a Wednesday night in March, past 11 o'clock when the streets are empty. He pushes the machine out of the shed and onto Brush Street, which is unpaved but smooth enough in the dry season. He checks the chain tension one more time, tops up the fuel, sets the ignition timing by feel, the way he has learned to set it, a quarter turn retarded from the mark, because the engine runs cleaner at low speed that way. He cranks the flywheel. The engine catches on the second pull. He climbs onto the plank seat. The machine is vibrating under him, all of it, frame and seat and footboards, a continuous mechanical trembling that goes up through his legs into his chest. He releases the handbrake, engages the chain drive with a lever he has rigged from a bent steel rod. The machine moves. It moves slowly at first, barely faster than walking, the iron rims crunching on the packed earth of the street. the engine note rising slightly as the load comes on. He steers with the T-bar handle, which requires more effort than he expected. The front axle has friction he hasn't fully resolved yet, but it steers. He passes the laundry. He passes the cooper's shop. He passes the dark front of Harrigan's, shut and locked, and thinks briefly about what Harrigan would say if he saw this. The chain comes off at the corner of Brush and Larned. The engine revs free for one startled second before he kills it, and the machine coasts to a stop with a sound like a pile of loose hardware sliding to one side. He climbs down, reseats the chain on the sprocket, tightens the chain tensioner 2 turns, checks that nothing else has moved. Total time, 4 minutes. He climbs back on, restarts the engine, and completes 2 more blocks before turning around and driving back to the shed. Total distance, 3 city blocks. Total time in motion, 11 minutes. The only witness is an old man on a bench outside a closed saloon on Larned Street who watches the machine pass with the serene, unsurprised expression of a man who has seen a great many things in his years and made peace with most of them. Horse broke down, the man says, to no one in particular. Edward does not answer. He pulls the machine back into the shed and sits on the dirt floor with his back against the frame and does the accounting out loud, quietly. Machine running, frame holds. Chain needs a better tensioner. 3 hours of work. Steering needs adjustment. Another 2 hours. He pauses. Patent not filed. Money $4.30. Days left in the month 18. He pauses again. No one saw it. He thinks about this for a moment. The machine ticks as the engine cools. Through the shed wall, he can hear the last dray horses on the street, iron shoes on the road, the sound that has meant transportation for 3,000 years, and will, he is now completely certain, mean it for perhaps 30 more. He is about to stand up and go back to his room when he hears them. Wheels on the road outside, multiple vehicles moving at a trot. He looks through the crack in the shed door and sees 3 freight wagons rolling north on Brush Street. Heavy wagons, loaded, drawn by matched pairs. Fresh paint on the sideboards. The Danforth sun and horseshoe mark in black and gold. New enough that it still looks wet in the lamplight. Behind the wagons, a lighter open carriage, 2-seat, the good kind that Brant charges $80 for. In the carriage, beside the company manager, Edward recognizes him, Aldous Webb, who has been running the East Side stables since before Edward was born. There's a boy, 11 years old, red-haired, new wool coat with a velvet collar, the kind Virginia buys for the purpose of being seen buying it. The boy is looking at the street ahead, with the focused, proprietorial expression of someone being shown what will someday be his. Then the carriage draws level with the shed. Charles Danforth looks through the gap in the shed door. Edward does not know if he can be seen. The shed is dark, and the gap is narrow, but Charles looks directly at him, with the certainty of someone who knew to look, holds the look for 3 full seconds, then turns back to the road ahead, deliberately, with the practiced indifference that Virginia has been installing in him since he was old enough to learn it. The carriage moves on. The wagons move on. The Danforth sun and horseshoe rolls north up Brush Street and disappears into the dark. Edward stands at the shed door for a moment after the sound of the wheels fades, so they know he is here. They have known probably since the newspaper landlady mentioned his name to the neighbor. They know he is in this shed on this street, with something they cannot identify but which Virginia, who is not stupid, has certainly been watching. Good, let them watch. He goes back inside and picks up his notebook and starts sketching the chain tensioner improvement. He has 3 hours before he needs to sleep. The man is standing outside the shed door when Edward arrives on a Thursday morning. He is about 40, stocky, with a mechanic's posture, weight forward, hands slightly away from his sides the way men carry them when they are used to working in close quarters around moving equipment. His coat is clean but old. His boots are the kind that have been resoled at least twice by someone who knew what they were doing. He is looking at the shed door with an expression that suggests he has been standing there long enough to have formed opinions about the structural integrity of the hinges. "You're the one with the horseless carriage," he says. "Not a question. Who told you that?" "Drunk Irishman at Connolly's bar. Said he saw a broken horse on Brush Street 3 weeks ago. Made no sense, so I figured it was either true or he was drunker than usual." The man extends one hand. "Oscar Weiss. I worked track maintenance for Michigan Central Railroad for 11 years until their new superintendent decided Germans were not the fashion. I am currently unemployed." Edward shakes the hand. The grip is what he expected. Firm, calibrated, the handshake of a man who does precise work and knows the difference between tight and over-tight. "Edward Danforth. I know. The Danforth stables Danforth." Weiss says this without any particular inflection, which Edward appreciates more than he would appreciate tact. "Can I see the machine?" Edward opens the shed door. Weiss walks in and stands in front of the machine for approximately 90 seconds without speaking. He circles it once, looking at the frame welds, the chain drive, the engine mounting. He crouches and looks at the rear axle from below. He straightens up and looks at the engine, the cylinder, the valve arrangement, the ignition wire running up to the fuel intake. He does not touch anything. Then he says, "The piston clearance is wrong." "I know," Edward says. "The chain tensioner is a temporary fix for a problem that wants a proper solution." "I know that too. The crankshaft is balanced by eye. I can see it from here." "Do you want to stand here listing problems?" Edward says. "Or do you want to work?" Weiss looks at him. A long pause, the kind that is doing more thinking than the length of the silence would suggest. What are you offering? 8% of the business. When there is a business, there isn't one now. No. Right now, there's a shed and a machine in 18 days before the landlord takes the shed back. 8% of nothing. 8% of whatever this becomes, which will not be nothing. Weiss looks at the machine again. Edward watches him looking at it and understands that Weiss is not looking at what it is. He is looking at what it implies, the same way Edward has been looking at it for 3 months. A man who spent 11 years keeping railroad machinery running has a particular relationship with the idea of mechanical transportation. He understands in the physical and not merely theoretical sense what it means for a machine to move people and goods across distance. He has spent his career maintaining the infrastructure of one such machine and has just lost his position on it. 8%, Weiss says, and I buy my own food. Agreed. Weiss takes off his coat, hangs it on the nail by the door, and says, the piston first. Do you have access to a lathe? Evenings at Harrigan's on Bates Street. Harrigan. Weiss considers this. Old man, Irish, red nose, good equipment for his size of shop. You know him? I know every machine shop in this city. Weiss is already crouching beside the engine, looking at the piston from above. We'll need the lathe tonight. The clearance on this is... He checks it with a finger, feeling the play. His expression suggests that a word much stronger than wrong is being professionally suppressed. Tonight, he says again. The argument about the machine starts 40 minutes later. Weiss has been examining the frame joints when he straightens up and says, without preamble, we need to rebuild this from the frame up, properly. The current construction will give us problems in every system simultaneously within the first 100 hours of operation. We don't have 100 hours to rebuild it, Edward says. We need to demonstrate it now. Get capital, build the next one correctly. Demonstrating a machine that is structurally compromised will cost us more credibility than having nothing. Demonstrating a machine that works will get us what we need to build the proper version. And if it fails during the demonstration, then we fix it and try again. Weiss stares at him. This is your method. Try, fail, fix, repeat. Yes, in the shortest possible cycle. Engineers build correctly the first time. Engineers with workshops and funding and 3 years of lead time build correctly the first time. I have a shed in 18 days. A silence. Weiss looks at the machine, looks at Edward, looks at the machine again with the expression of a man who is finding it necessary to revise several professional principles simultaneously. The piston tonight, he says. Finally, the crankshaft Sunday. I will make a list of the other deficiencies in order of criticality, and we will address them in that order, while you pursue the capital. But we do not demonstrate until I have cleared at least the top 4 items on the list. Agreed, Edward says. He would have agreed to the top 2 and negotiated from there, but 4 is acceptable. He does not say this. That evening at Harrigan's, Weiss sits down at the lathe and Edward watches him work for 30 seconds and then stops watching, because watching Weiss on a lathe is the mechanical equivalent of watching a concert pianist. It is clearly operating on a level where observation offers more self-criticism than education. Weiss cuts the piston down in 2 passes, checking bore fit between each one, using a dial indicator he produced from his coat pocket, with the matter-of-fact manner of a man who carries precision instruments the way other men carry pocket watches. Final clearance, 16/10,000ths of an inch, half what Edward had achieved with his file and his calipers and his best effort. The difference when they run the engine 2 days later is immediate and physical. The engine note changes character, less ragged at the edges, more consistent in its rhythm. The vibration through the frame drops noticeably. And when Edward drives the machine the length of the block and back, the acceleration is not the labored, slightly reluctant forward motion he has been used to. It is clean, purposeful, 30% he estimates, maybe more. He sits in the shed after the test and says nothing for a moment. He could have gotten there eventually with the tools available to him, but eventually is a currency he cannot afford right now. He looks at Weiss, who is checking the engine temperature with the back of his hand and making notes in his small black book. Good, Edward says. That is all. Weiss does not look up. Crankshaft Sunday, he says. 3 days after the crankshaft is rebalanced, Edward walks into the offices of the Detroit Free Press on Lafayette Street. He has thought carefully about what he is offering. Not a story. A newspaper editor has no reason to care about a machine no one has heard of, built by a man with no reputation, operating out of a shed. What he is offering is a transaction, value delivered in exchange for attention. The editor is a man named Murphy, Henry Murphy, 45, with ink-stained fingers and the permanent slight squint of a man who reads small type under bad light for 12 hours a day. He is also visibly a man whose operation is currently impaired. The mechanical printing press in the back room has been silent for 3 weeks, which Edward determined by observing the handwritten notice in the window explaining the slight delay in circulation, and by talking to the delivery boy on the street who volunteered the information that the big machine broke, and Mr. Murphy is extremely sore about it. The press in your back room, Edward says, standing in front of Murphy's desk. I'll fix it today, no charge. Murphy leans back in his chair. What do you want? You come to see a demonstration of my machine. Personally, that's all. Machine. A carriage that runs without a horse. Murphy's expression travels through skepticism, calculation, and professional curiosity, and settles somewhere between the last two. If you can fix the press, he says, I'll come see your toy carriage. The press takes 6 hours. The main drive gear has a cracked tooth that has been slowly destroying the gear it meshes with, and whoever examined it before Edward decided the solution was to grease it more heavily. which delayed the failure by approximately 2 weeks and made the eventual repair significantly messier. Edward replaces the cracked gear with a piece he machines on the shop's own small metal lathe. The Free Press has one for making type blocks, which Murphy did not initially mention but which Edward found by walking to the back of the building and looking. The repair is clean. The press runs. Murphy comes to the shed the following afternoon, hands in his coat pockets, hat slightly against the wind. Weiss is not present. He said he had an errand, which Edward understood to mean he did not want to watch what he considered a premature demonstration, and had chosen to express this opinion by being elsewhere. Edward starts the engine, drives the machine 1 full block, turns it around, drives back. Midway through the return run, the chain comes off. The tensioner issue still not fully resolved, and he pulls over, climbs down, reseats the chain, wipes his hands on the rag he keeps under the seat, and drives the remaining 30 feet to where Murphy is standing. Murphy is quiet for a moment. How fast does it go? Currently about 12 miles per hour on a good surface. And you fixed it, just now, on the road. 80 seconds. Murphy looks at the machine, looks at Edward, turns and walks back toward the press offices, without another word. 2 days later, on the bottom of the 4th page, 4 lines in 8-point type. Detroit mechanic. Claims horseless carriage operable. Mr. Edward Danforth, formerly of the Danforth stable family, reports completion of a self-propelled vehicle running on a petroleum-based fuel. The apparatus was observed briefly by this correspondent. No photograph, no column space, 4 sentences. Edward reads it at Harrigan's over lunch and counts the words. 81. He has spent 3 years of his life building toward those 81 words, and they fit on 3 inches of column at the bottom of a page that also carries an advertisement for boot polish. He folds the paper and puts it in his jacket. At home that evening he does the accounting. $16 saved from Harrigan's wages and after-hours repairs. $35 needed for a patent filing, $19 short. Shed rental due in 2 weeks. Weiss has cleared 3 of his 4 critical items and is making pointed observations about the 4th. He is still looking at the numbers when a knock comes at his door. Mrs. Callahan, the landlady, with an envelope that was dropped off that afternoon. Return address, the office of Clement and Howe, attorneys at law. He opens it. The letter is brief and professionally cold. Danforth Stables, LLC, has completed the acquisition of the commercial property at the corner of Brush and Lafayette Streets, 3 blocks from the shed, with full construction of a new 15-stall station to begin within the month. The firm of Clement and Howe represents the interests of Mrs. Virginia Danforth and Mr. Charles W. Danforth in all matters pertaining to the above. Edward sets the letter on the table, reads it once more. 15 stalls, 3 blocks away. They have bought that corner. Specifically, there are larger available lots farther out. He has seen the sale notices. They bought that one because it is 3 blocks from this shed, and they want him to know they bought it. Virginia read the 4 lines in the Free Press and answered with a 15-stall stable and a lawyer's letterhead. He thinks about this for a moment. Then he picks up his notebook and writes at the top of a fresh page, patent, $35. Below it, sources. He has $19 to find. He begins making a list of every broken thing within walking distance of this room that someone might pay him to fix. Brandt talks. This is something Edward has known since the first week of their arrangement. The old German carriage maker has the particular sociability of a man who works alone all day and compensates by being generous with information in the evenings. He talks at the hardware counter, at the lumber yard, and evidently at whatever establishment serves beer on the corner of Laurent and 3rd, because 3 weeks after the 4 lines appear in the Free Press, a carriage arrives at the shed that does not belong to the neighborhood. It is a double-seat landau, black lacquered, with brass fittings and a coachman in a proper coat. The kind of vehicle that costs more than most men in this part of Detroit earn in a year. It stops outside the shed and a man gets out who moves with the unhurried confidence of someone who has not needed to hurry for a long time. Antonio Ferrari is 55, compact, well-dressed in the Italian fashion, good wool, good boots, a dark coat that sits correctly on his shoulders. His hair is silver at the temples and his mustache is trimmed with the precision of a man who pays someone else to maintain it. He walks to the shed door and stops and looks at the machine inside for a long time without speaking. His assistant, younger, thin, with a ledger under his arm, stands behind him and also says nothing. Ferrari turns to the assistant and says something in Italian. The assistant nods, writes something in the ledger. Ferrari turns back to the machine. How much to buy it, he says. His English carries the architecture of Italian underneath it, the vowels landing in slightly different places than they should. It's not for sale, Edward says. Ferrari smiles. Not a large smile, the kind that acknowledges a predictable answer has been given. Then how much to make me a partner? Edward looks at him. Who told you about this? Friedrich Brandt. He tells me you built something interesting. Friedrich does not use that word loosely. Ferrari steps into the shed closer to the machine and crouches to look at the engine. He does not touch it. He looks at the cylinder, the valves, the ignition arrangement. This is your design. All of it. All of it. How long? The engine, 3 years of development. The machine, 4 months of assembly. Ferrari stands. I have a factory, 200 workers. We make the finest carriage bodies in Michigan, perhaps in the country. I have customers who would purchase this machine tomorrow if I could offer it to them. He pauses. What I do not have is the engine. What you do not have is everything else. He lets that sit for a moment. I propose a partnership. I will give you $800 immediately. I will provide workshop space in my facility with access to proper equipment. In return, you build engines for me. I build the bodies and frames. We produce the complete machine together. Oscar is standing at the back of the shed. Edward does not look at him, but he can feel the quality of Oscar's silence. It is a silence that contains a specific opinion being forcibly held back. I want to think about it, Edward says. Of course. Ferrari produces a card from his coat pocket and sets it on the workbench. I'm available tomorrow morning. He nods once, goes back to his carriage, and is gone within 90 seconds of arriving. Edward picks up the card, turns it over, sets it down. He wants to cut you in half, Oscar says immediately. You make the brain, he makes the body. The body is what people see. The body has his name on it. The brain is hidden inside and nobody knows whose it is. I know. $800, Oscar says, in a tone that indicates he is aware of how much $800 is and finds the awareness inconvenient. I know that too. So you're going to take it. Edward looks at the card. Temporarily, he says. Oscar makes the sound that German mechanics make when they disagree with a decision and have decided to disagree with it permanently, but quietly. The meeting with Ferrari the next morning takes 40 minutes. The arrangement is this. Edward will design and build engines for Ferrari's vehicles. Ferrari will build all frames, bodies, and wheel assemblies. The engines will be installed at Ferrari's factory. Ferrari will sell the completed vehicles under the Ferrari name. Edward will receive a per-unit payment of $15 per engine, plus a monthly workshop fee of $30. The $800 is an advance against the first 25 engines delivered. Edward reads the contract twice, slowly, $15 per engine. Ferrari will sell the vehicles for no less than $400 each. He has mentioned this himself, in the tone of a man accustomed to that price point. The margin on each machine, somewhere between $350 and $380. Edward's share, 15 less than 4%. Ferrari has constructed an arrangement in which Edward's contribution, the part without which the machine literally does not move, is priced as a component, not a partnership. He signs it. He needs the $800 more than he needs the argument. Ferrari shakes his hand with the warm efficiency of a man who has just completed a purchase he is satisfied with. The workshop Ferrari provides is in the northwest corner of his factory on East Jefferson Avenue, a space of roughly 800 square feet with 3 good lathes, a milling machine, a drill press, and access to the factory's foundry for casting work. It is more and better equipment than Edward has used in his entire working life to date. He stands in the middle of it the first morning and does not move for almost 2 minutes, just looking at the machines, identifying each one, calculating what he can now do that he could not do before. Oscar stands in the doorway and watches him. Don't fall in love with it, Oscar says. It's not yours. I know. Edward walks to the nearest lathe and runs his hand along the bed. Cast iron, ground flat, a good brand. But I can use it. Ferrari's requirement for the first engine is specific. Double the output of the current single-cylinder design, in a package no larger than 1.5 times the existing volume. He has customers who want speed. The current machine, which he has been demonstrating to selected clients from his carriage business, moves adequately. He wants it to move impressively. Edward spends 4 days drawing before he touches a piece of metal. 2 cylinders, not simply 2 single cylinders bolted together, which is the obvious solution and the wrong one, because the vibration from 2 pistons firing independently will shake any frame apart inside a month. The cylinders need to fire in sequence, with the crankshaft designed to balance the opposing forces of each piston against the other. This is not mechanical arithmetic. This is mechanical geometry, 3-dimensional, in motion, and getting it wrong at the design stage means discovering the error at speed on a public road with someone sitting in the vehicle. He draws and calculates for 4 days. Oscar looks over his shoulder on the second day, says nothing, and on the third day begins making suggestions in the form of questions. What happens to the bearing load here when both pistons are at top dead center simultaneously? This is Oscar's method of pointing out a problem. He asks a question to which he knows the answer, and waits for Edward to find the same answer himself. Edward finds it. He adjusts the crankshaft geometry. Oscar asks another question. Edward adjusts something else. On the 4th day, Oscar stops asking questions. This means the design is correct. Machining takes 3 weeks. The cylinder block is cast at Ferrari's foundry from a pattern Edward makes in wood first, checking dimensions, then making the metal version. The crankshaft is the most complex single piece he has ever machined. 4 throws, balanced. The bearing surface is ground to a tolerance that requires the factory's best grinding wheel and 3 full days of work. Oscar does the crankshaft. Edward does not suggest otherwise. When they first run the 2-cylinder engine on the test stand in the workshop corner, the difference from the single cylinder is not merely quantitative. The sound is different, deeper, more even, a mechanical authority that the single cylinder with its periodic firing never achieved. The vibration on the test stand is lower, not higher, because the opposing pistons cancel each other's impulse in the way Edward calculated they would. Oscar stands beside him, listening to it run. After 30 seconds, he says the exhaust timing on the second cylinder is 3 degrees late. He has measured this by ear. Edward checks it. Oscar is right. He adjusts it. The engine note smooths out by a further degree. Better, Oscar says. This is from Oscar, the equivalent of a standing ovation. Ferrari installs the engine in his best vehicle, a light four-seat body in dark green with leather interior and spoke wheels with rubber tires, the finest piece his coachmakers have produced. He drives it himself around the block outside his factory, while Edward and Oscar stand on the sidewalk and watch. Ferrari is not a mechanical man. He is a commercial man, but even a commercial man can feel the difference between 40 minutes and 20, which is approximately how much faster the new machine covers a fixed distance compared to the old one. Ferrari parks the vehicle, climbs out, and looks at Edward with an expression that has changed in character from the expression he wore at the shed 3 months ago. That expression said, "I am buying a component." This expression says something else, something more careful. "I want 100 of these," Ferrari says. Edward nods. "We'll need to discuss production terms. We will discuss it tomorrow. Tonight I'm showing this to 3 men who will each buy one before the week is out." Ferrari gets back in the vehicle and drives it into his factory yard, already calling to his foreman. Edward stands on the sidewalk and does the arithmetic. 100 engines at $15 each is $1,500 for him. 100 vehicles at $400 each is $40,000 for Ferrari, plus whatever premium he charges for the new performance, $50,000 perhaps, maybe more. He is being paid 3 cents on every dollar this enterprise generates. "You see it now," Oscar says beside him. He is not asking. "I saw it before I signed the contract." "Then why?" "Because $800 bought me access to that foundry and those lathes for 3 months. Edward looks at the factory building, the size of it, the equipment inside it, the 200 workers who know how to do things he needed to learn. "I've been learning and building." Oscar looks at him. "Building what?" "We've been building his engines." "I've been building his engines," Edward says. "I've been building something else in the evenings." He has rented a second space. It is much smaller than the Ferrari workshop, a single room behind a blacksmith shop on Champlain Street, accessible through a side alley, with one window and enough floor space for a workbench, and the small lathe he purchased secondhand for $40, which represents 5 weeks of his per-engine payments, and which he told Oscar about the day he bought it. Oscar said nothing. Oscar has known for weeks. He has seen the grease on Edward's hands at 7 in the morning. That is a different composition from the grease at Ferrari's factory, and Oscar notices these things the way he notices engine timing by ear. In the Champlain Street room, there is a workbench covered in drawings. Not drawings of 2-cylinder engines that Ferrari has asked for. Drawings of a 3-cylinder engine that no one has asked for yet. Lighter than the 2-cylinder. More powerful. With an ignition system that is fundamentally different from the one Ferrari's vehicles are currently using. Not a directly wired spark, but a magneto-driven system that generates its own current from the rotation of the engine itself, making the whole machine independent of any external electrical source. The Ferrari vehicles need a battery. Edward's next engine will not. "How long have you been working in there?" Oscar asks. "Since the 2nd week at the factory." A pause. "How far along is it?" "Drawings are complete. I start machining the cylinder block next week." Edward looks at the factory door that has just closed behind Ferrari's green vehicle. He's going to want the 100 engines in 6 months. "I'll deliver them. And while I'm delivering them, I'll finish the next generation. And when I'm done delivering them, I'll have a better engine than anything inside that building. A workshop of my own. And enough money to start the thing that matters." Oscar is quiet for a moment. "And Ferrari?" "Ferrari will have $50,000 and a factory full of vehicles with my first-generation engine in them. In 2 years, those engines will be obsolete." Edward picks up his jacket from the bench. "I didn't steal anything from him. I sold him exactly what we agreed. What I do on Champlain Street at 9 in the evening is my own business." Oscar looks at him for a long moment with the expression he wears when he is deciding whether to say the thing he is thinking. He decides against it. He picks up his own coat. "Champlain Street," he says. "I assume you need a second set of hands." Edward looks at him. "You knew about the room." "I've known for 3 weeks. And you waited. I wanted to see how long it took you to tell me." Oscar buttons his coat. "I have opinions about the ignition system. I'll share them on the way." They walk out into the evening together, and behind them, through the closed factory doors, the green vehicle with the 2-cylinder engine sits in the yard, already worth more money than either of them has ever held in their hands, and already in the only way that matters out of date. 3 months into the arrangement with Ferrari, Edward has built 40 engines. 40 engines means 40 vehicles on the streets of Detroit and its surrounding counties, all of them carrying the Ferrari name in polished brass on the dashboard panel. The vehicles are talked about in the newspapers. Not the 4-line notices on the back page, but real coverage. Half-Cullens with descriptions of the ride quality and the speed and the novelty of a carriage that requires no horse. Ferrari's name appears in each article, his factory, his craftsmanship, his vision for modern transportation. Edward's name appears nowhere. He knows this is the arrangement he signed. He reads each article anyway, carefully, and then sets it aside and goes back to work. He is building the 3rd-generation engine on Champlain Street in the evenings, and 3 weeks ago Oscar finished the crankshaft, and the design is better than anything Ferrari currently has in his showroom. The articles with the wrong name on them are fuel. He uses them accordingly. The 41st engine is half finished on the Ferrari workshop bench when the foreman mentions, in passing, that 2 of the floor workers were let go last week. Bartolo and Gennaro, both Italians, both assigned to the body assembly line. Dismissed for cause, the foreman says, without specifying the cause, in a way that suggests he either doesn't know or has been told not to say. Edward notes this, files it, continues working. What Edward does not know, and will not know for another 3 weeks, is what happened in the 6 days before those two men were let go. Charles Danforth is 13 years old and has been running alongside his mother's business decisions since he was 10. Virginia has been careful about his education, not the school kind, which is adequate but not the point, but the commercial kind. She has shown him how a business works, how it can be threatened, and how threats are managed. She has explained with the directness she applies to all practical matters that Edward is a problem. Not a large problem yet, but the kind of small problem that becomes large if left unaddressed. Bartolo and Gennaro were paid $5 each for a single evening's work. The work was to walk slowly past the Ferrari workshop during their lunch break and look at the engine on the bench, and later, in a room above a saloon on Gratiot Avenue, draw what they had seen. The man who received the drawings was not Charles himself. Charles is careful about direct contact, but a lawyer's clerk who works for Clement and Howe, the same firm that sent the letter about the new stable on Brush Street. The drawings reached the Danforth stable manager, a practical man named Aldous Webb who has been running horse operations for 22 years and understands machinery only in the most general terms. Webb brings in a mechanic he has used for equipment repairs. The mechanic looks at the drawings for a long time and says he thinks he can build it. He builds it over the course of 4 weeks in the maintenance shed behind the east stable. The result runs briefly, partially in the sense that the cylinder fires and the piston moves, and the crankshaft turns through approximately a quarter revolution before the whole assembly seizes and stops. The mechanic looks at it for a long time, takes it apart, looks at the drawings again. He goes to Webb. Webb goes to Charles. The design is incomplete. The ignition system isn't in the drawings. Without it, the engine won't run for more than a few seconds. Charles is sitting at the desk in what was his father's study, and is now his study at least for another 5 years, until he turns 18 and the estate passes to him fully. He looks out the window at the stable yard where 3 of the new Ferrari-style carriages have been parked by wealthy neighbors who stopped by to show them off to each other. Then get the full design, Charles says. Webb. The only way to get the full design is from the man who designed it. Charles looks at the carriages for a moment longer. Then remove the man. He says this in the flat, practical tone Virginia uses when she discusses commercial decisions. He has been practicing that tone. Edward is asleep in his room above the laundry when the smell reaches him. It is not the sharp chemical smell of an accidental fire, burning cloth, spilled oil catching a lantern. It is the particular smell of a fire that has been set deliberately and given a head start, already through the dry lumber stage and into the structural stage, the kind of smell that means there is very little time, and the thing burning is already past saving. He is out of bed before he is fully awake, coat over his nightshirt, boots without socks, down the stairs and out the back and around the corner, and the shed is already orange from 50 feet away. The doors are gone, the roof is going. He gets within 20 feet, and the heat stops him like a wall. He stands there for a moment and does the inventory without meaning to, because this is how his mind works even when he does not want it to. The machine is in the Ferrari workshop, safe. The third-generation engine components are on Champlain Street, safe. What is in the shed? Spare parts from the original assembly. Old chain stock, 2 spare cylinders he had been keeping as test pieces, tooling he doesn't need anymore, and the original drawings, the first notebook, the one from the room above the laundry where he designed the engine the first time. The pages filled with his own handwriting on the right side, and on the left margins of certain pages, titles and section headers written in a careful, elegant hand that is not his. His mother had written those headers. He had asked her to, one evening when she was feeling well enough to sit at the table, when he was 14 and the notebook was new and the engine was still entirely theoretical. She had looked at his rough sketch titles, cylinder assembly, valve timing, ignition, and without comment had taken the pen and rewritten them in her handwriting, clean and precise, the same hand she used for household accounts. She had not asked what any of it meant. The notebook is in the shed. The shed is on fire. This is a calculation with one answer. He goes around to the side of the building, the wall that faces the laundry brick still intact enough to touch, and finds the single small window that looks into the corner where he kept the notebooks on a shelf. The window glass is already cracked from the heat. He wraps his coat around his hand and breaks it, reaches in, pulls back immediately from the rush of heat and smoke. He can feel the shelf. The shelf is empty. The notebooks have either fallen or burned. He stands back. Oscar arrives 4 minutes later, still in his work clothes, which means he was not asleep. He stands next to Edward and looks at the shed and says nothing for a long time. From the shed, Edward takes only one thing. He had carried it upstairs to his room 2 weeks ago to clean the frame, the silver photograph of his mother, slightly warped from the heat of the room during the summer, which he had left sitting on his windowsill and which is, therefore, not in the shed. He holds it in both hands and looks at the fire. The drawings are in your head, Oscar says beside him. Not in the paper, I know. Everything you need to rebuild is in that workshop and on Champlain Street. I know. They stand there until the shed roof comes down. Then they go inside. In the morning, the Detroit Courier carries an advertisement on page 2, half a column, bordered in black. the Danforth Sun and Horseshoe mark at the top. Danforth Stables, Michigan's transportation heritage. We are pleased to announce that Danforth Stables is actively exploring the development of mechanical carriage solutions for postal and freight routes. Danforth, tradition, quality, in the spirit of progress, Est 1840. Edward reads this at Harrigan's over breakfast, because Mrs. Callahan's copy of the paper is on the table in the hall, and he read it on the way out. They stole the idea, they could not build it. And now they are borrowing the name of the concept, mechanical carriages, the spirit of progress, and attaching it to 120 years of stable management, as though the two things are continuous. As though Virginia Danforth looked at a horseless carriage and thought, yes, naturally this is what we do next. He sets the paper down on Harrigan's counter and finishes his coffee. He walks to Ferrari's factory. It is not yet 8 in the morning. Ferrari is at his desk. He arrives early, Edward has noticed, which is one of the genuinely admirable things about him. He looks up when Edward comes in. I heard about the fire, Ferrari says. Are you all right? I'm fine. The machine and the workshop are untouched. Edward sits down across the desk. Antonio, I need $400 against the next delivery of engines. Advance payment. Ferrari looks at him steadily. He is a man who reads people the way Edward reads mechanisms, by looking at the functional relationships, not the surface. He is reading something now in Edward's face and posture, and Edward knows he is reading it, and neither of them mentions it. That's a large advance, Ferrari says. Against 27 engines at $15 each, it's less than the full value. You'll receive delivery on schedule. I need to replace equipment and hire 2 additional mechanics. 2 mechanics, Ferrari says. What are their names? I haven't hired them yet. A pause. Ferrari picks up his pen and holds it without writing anything. Edward, are you building something I should know about? I'm building engines for you, Edward says. On schedule? At the agreed specifications. He pauses one beat. Is there something in the contract that restricts what I do outside the agreed work? Ferrari puts the pen down. He looks at Edward for a long moment. Not hostile, not warm, calculating. He is 55 years old and has been in business for 30 of those years, and he has had this conversation before in other forms. He knows what it means when a man asks about the contract instead of answering the question. He opens his desk drawer, removes a bank draft, and writes $400. He slides it across the desk. On schedule, he says. On schedule. Edward agrees. He takes the draft, stands, buttons his coat. One more thing, he says, at the door. Those 2 floor workers you dismissed last week, Bartolo and Gennaro. Ferrari's expression does not change. Production matter, reassignment issue. Of course, Edward nods. Good morning, Antonio. He walks out into the street with $400 in his coat pocket and the precise understanding of how the next 6 months need to work. The fire took the old drawings, the advertisement took the family name, and tried to attach it to a concept Virginia cannot actually execute. Charles paid $5 to men who drew an incomplete engine and then asked someone to set a fire when the drawing turned out to be useless. Amateur methods. He can work with amateur methods. He has the $400, he has the Champlain Street workshop. He has Oscar. He has a 3rd-generation engine that Ferrari has not seen and will not see until it is finished. And he has now the formal understanding that the arrangement with Ferrari is a mechanism with a known end date, and that the important question is not how to preserve the arrangement but how to use what remains of it. He walks to Champlain Street. Oscar is already there, standing over the half-finished cylinder block with a micrometer. The advance came through, Edward says. Oscar doesn't look up. How much? 400? And Ferrari? He knows something is happening. He doesn't know what. How long before he does? Edward hangs his coat on the hook by the door and picks up his notebook. Long enough, he says. He opens the notebook to the page where he has been listing the equipment he needs to buy. He draws a line through the first 5 items. Those are covered now. He looks at what remains. 2 more lathes, a grinding wheel. Hire 3 mechanics with foundry experience, 1 with pattern making. Lease, a larger space, ground floor, freight access. He starts writing names next to each item. People he has met at Harrigan's, at the ferry workshop, at the rail depot. He has watched work. Men who know what they are doing and are currently doing it for someone else. The Champlain Street room is too small for what comes next. He knows this already. He has known it since the first week. But it was the right size for the beginning, and the beginning is ending. And what has to happen now is different in scale from everything before it. He looks at the photograph of his mother, which he has set on the corner of the workbench, because there is nowhere else to put it. I know. He says to no one. He picks up his pen and gets back to work. Oscar sells his father's pocket watch on a Tuesday morning and arrives at the Champlain Street room with $60 and no expression that invites discussion of the matter. Edward does not ask. He adds the $60 to the $400 from Ferrari and the $240 he has accumulated from engine payments over the past 3 months. And he writes the total on the top of a fresh page, $700. Below it he writes what $700 buys, workshop lease 60 square meters in the industrial quarter on St. Antoine Street, $18 a month, 6 months paid in advance, $108. 2 lathes, second-hand from a machine shop in Toledo that closed in the spring, purchased through a broker for $220 total. delivered by freight wagon. 3 mechanics hired at $12 a month each, $36 monthly. Materials for the first production run of the new engine. Estimated $90. Total committed $544, remaining $156. He looks at the number for a moment. Thin margin, acceptable. The St. Antoine workshop is a ground floor space in a brick building that also houses a cooperage and a small iron foundry. The foundry is the reason he chose the building, access to casting facilities without the cost of owning them. The workshop itself is 60 square meters of concrete floor, 2 high windows on the north wall, a freight door on the alley side wide enough for a loaded wagon. When Edward and Oscar arrive with the first wagon of equipment, the space is empty except for one wooden chair with a broken leg, which Oscar picks up, examines, and repairs before they unload anything else, because Oscar is constitutionally incapable of leaving a broken thing unaddressed. The 3 mechanics are young. Marcus is 22, trained at a railway workshop in Cleveland, left because the foreman was incompetent and he was tired of fixing the foreman's mistakes. Joseph is 20, self-taught, has been working at a pump repair shop for 2 years and arrived with a set of files he made himself, which tells Edward everything relevant. Thomas is 24, the oldest of the 3, has hands that are too skilled for his age, which means he learned somewhere unusual. It turns out he grew up in a machine shop his uncle ran in Cincinnati that made scientific instruments, and the tolerance standards of scientific instruments are an order of magnitude tighter than anything in carriage manufacture. Edward explains the work to each of them once, then he shows them the drawing. There is a particular moment he has observed, in the men he has worked with, when a drawing stops being a piece of paper and becomes a real thing in their minds, when they can see it running, can see the parts moving in relation to each other, can feel in their hands what it will take to build. He watches for this moment with each of the 3. Marcus gets there in 30 seconds. Joseph takes 2 minutes and asks 4 questions. First, Thomas looks at the drawings for a long time without speaking, and then puts his finger on a specific dimension and says, "This bearing surface. You want this surface ground, not just turned." He is right. Edward had planned to specify it in the work instructions and hadn't yet. Yes, Edward says exactly that. The engine he is building on St. Antoine Street is not the 2nd generation. It is by Edward's own numbering, the 3rd, the one he has been developing on Champlain Street for the past 4 months while completing the Ferrari contract. 3 cylinders, which gives it the firing balance that 2 cylinders only approximate. Forced water cooling, which solves the overheating problem that limits how hard the 1st and 2nd generation engines can be run. And the magneto ignition. No battery, no external electrical source. The engine generating its own spark from the rotation of a small permanent magnet assembly driven off the crankshaft. The magneto is the part that has cost the most evenings. The principle is not new: electromagnetic induction, Faraday, 30 years of physics textbooks. The application to a small, fast-running internal combustion engine is new, because the timing requirements are precise in a way that static electrical machinery never has to be. The spark has to arrive at the cylinder at exactly the right moment in the piston's travel. Too early, the piston fights the combustion. Too late, the combustion is wasted. In the battery system, timing can be adjusted by moving the spark plug wire. In the magneto system, timing is set by the geometry of the magnet assembly, which means getting it wrong is not a matter of adjusting a connection, but of rebuilding the assembly. Edward has rebuilt the magneto assembly 4 times. The 5th version works correctly across the full speed range of the engine. He tests it for 6 hours straight on the Champlain Street bench before he is satisfied. He sets up the St. Antoine production line on a Thursday. The bench runs the full length of the north wall, 14 feet. He divides it into 7 stations, each one responsible for a specific assembly operation, with the work moving left to right across the bench as each station completes its task. Station 1, cylinder block preparation and bore inspection. Station 2, piston fitting and ring installation. Station 3, crankshaft assembly and main bearing installation. Station 4, valve train assembly and timing. Station 5, magneto assembly and timing verification. Station 6, cooling system assembly and pressure test. Station 7, final assembly and cold test. Oscar watches him mark out the stations on the bench with chalk. He crosses his arms and says nothing, which with Oscar means he is forming an opinion. It works on textile looms, Oscar says finally. I know, and on sewing machines and on rifle manufacture in the government arsenals. Edward marks the 7th station. I saw Ferrari's coachwork line. They move carriage bodies through 14 stations. 3 men do the work that 1 man would do in a 10th of the time. A carriage body is wood and leather. An engine is 40 precision components with tolerances in the thousandths. Correct, which is why each station has 1 task, not 5. Marcus does piston fitting at Station 2. He does nothing else. In a week he will fit pistons faster and more accurately than either of us, because he will have done it 200 times. Oscar looks at the chalk lines, and if the work coming into his station is wrong, then it comes back. Nothing moves right unless it passes inspection left. A silence. Oscar looks at the bench, looks at the chalk, uncrosses his arms. Station 3 needs to be wider, he says. Crankshaft assembly requires lateral clearance for the bearing installation tool. Edward moves the chalk line 8 inches. Better? Marginally. Oscar picks up a rag and wipes his hands, which is his version of conceding the argument. We run it for a month and then we measure. They run it for a month. Production in week 1, 3 complete engines. Week 2, 5. Week 3, 7. Week 4, 9. Oscar counts the engines at the end of the 4th week, looks at the number and says nothing, which is everything. Ferrari finds out about the Saint Antoine workshop in the 5th week. The mechanic's name is Robert Hayes, 21, hired in the 2nd week, quick hands, good instincts. He has also, it turns out, been passing information to Ferrari for $2 a week since his 3rd day of employment. Edward does not know this yet when Ferrari arrives unannounced at the Saint Antoine workshop on a Wednesday afternoon, his carriage outside, and his face carrying the particular expression of a man who has been patient for a long time and has decided to stop. Ferrari walks in, he looks at the bench, he looks at the 7 stations, the 3 mechanics at work, the 9 finished engines lined on the shelf at the far wall. He looks at these things for perhaps 15 seconds, doing the same arithmetic Edward would do, and then he turns to Edward. "You're in breach of our agreement," he says. His English, when he is controlled and cold, loses most of its Italian softening. "I provided capital. I provided equipment access. You have used that to build a competing operation. Our agreement required me to deliver engines on an agreed schedule at agreed specifications," Edward says. "I have delivered every engine on time. The last delivery was 6 days ago. I have never missed a date. You built this with my money. I built this with money you paid me for work I completed. What I do with earned payment is my own business. There is no exclusivity clause in the contract. I had it reviewed before I signed it." Ferrari looks at him. He is not a man who loses his composure, which is one of the things Edward has genuinely respected about him. He does not lose it now. He simply becomes very still. "I will take this to court." "You can?" Edward says. "Your legal position is that you paid a mechanic for completed work and the mechanic used his wages to start a business. That is not a breach of contract. That is employment." He pauses. "By the time your lawyers finish drafting the complaint, those 9 engines on the shelf will have been installed in 9 vehicles, sold to 9 customers under the Danforth name, and those vehicles will outperform anything currently running your first-generation engine by a margin your customers will feel in 30 seconds of driving." The word Danforth lands differently than the rest of the sentence. Ferrari hears it. The name on a vehicle means something in Detroit now. The Free Press has used it twice in the past month in connection with the machines Ferrari has been selling, because the reporter who covers commercial transportation has been doing his own research and has found that the engine inside the Ferrari vehicles comes from a man named Danforth. Ferrari looks at the engines on the shelf, looks at Edward. He is calculating something. Edward can see it, the same way you can see a gear train engaging, each thought moving the next. "You're going to put me out of business," Ferrari says. It is not an accusation, it is an assessment. "I'm going to build better engines than you currently have. What you do with that information is your decision." Ferrari nods once, a small, precise nod, the kind that closes a chapter. He turns and walks out. The carriage moves off down St. Antoine Street, and Edward watches it go from the freight door. He goes back inside and says to Marcus, "Robert Hayes, pay him through the end of the week. Tell him not to come in tomorrow." Marcus looks up from the piston bench. "You knew? I know what $2 a week looks like in a man's behavior." Edward picks up his notebook. "Finish the piston at Station 2 before you talk to him. The work doesn't stop." The war that follows is brief because it is asymmetric. Ferrari has money, an established factory, and 200 workers who know how to build carriage bodies. What he does not have is anyone who understands the 3rd-generation engine well enough to copy it. He poaches 3 mechanics from St. Antoine with offers of double the wage. Edward pays the remaining 5 triple. He hires 2 more from Harrigan's network. Older men, steadier, less susceptible to doubling. Each new hire signs a 2-page agreement that Oscar drafted, stating that any engine design knowledge acquired during employment is proprietary to the Danforth workshop and cannot be communicated to any third party for a period of 3 years after termination. Ferrari's workshop attempts to reverse engineer the 3rd-generation engine using the 3 men who left. The 3 men understand their individual stations but not the complete design. This was intentional, a thing Edward decided in the 2nd week of the production line without announcing it. No single mechanic at St. Antoine has seen all 7 stations in sufficient detail to reconstruct the whole. The attempt produces an engine that runs for 40 seconds before the magneto assembly fails, because the timing geometry requires knowledge that none of the 3 men possess. Edward hears about this from a supplier who also supplies Ferrari, and has no particular loyalty to either of them. He notes it in his notebook under a column he has started labeling competitive position, and continues working. By the end of the month, the accounting stands as follows. 12 3rd-generation engines complete. 3 sold directly to private customers in Detroit, a banker, a shipping merchant, a physician who read the Free Press article and sent a letter directly to the St. Antoine workshop address. Revenue from direct sales, $620. Outstanding invoices from Ferrari for the last 2 deliveries under the old contract, $340, which Ferrari has not paid, and which Edward's new lawyer, a young man named Curtis, who works for $12 a consultation, says can be collected with moderate effort. Cash on hand, $1,200. Ferrari, hostile, legally constrained, unable to copy the technology, losing customers who have seen the new machines and want them. Charles Danforth, quiet for 7 weeks. This is the part that requires attention. Oscar is cleaning the grinding wheel at the end of the day when Edward tells him the direct sale numbers. Oscar wipes down the wheel, sets the cloth aside, and looks at the 12 engines on the shelf. 12 engines, Oscar says. 12. 6 months ago, we had one engine and a shed. Yes. Oscar picks up his coat. Charles has been quiet, he says, which is the same thought Edward has been carrying for 7 weeks. I know. Quiet means he's planning something he thinks will actually work this time. Yes. Edward closes the notebook, which means we need to be somewhere he can't reach before he finishes planning it. He looks at the workshop, 60 square meters, 8 mechanics, 12 engines on a shelf. Good start. Wrong size for what comes next. He opens the notebook again and writes at the top of a fresh page, second workshop. Below it, he starts a list. Oscar takes the train to Washington on a Monday with $35 in an envelope, and Edward's complete patent application in a leather document case that used to belong to Harrigan and was given to Edward when the old man retired, along with a handshake and the words, "Don't waste it on anything stupid." The application covers the third-generation engine in full, the 3-cylinder configuration, the forced water cooling system, and the magneto-ignition assembly. Edward has spent 3 weeks writing it, which is longer than he has spent writing anything in his life, because a patent application is a specific kind of document that has to be precise enough to protect the invention and broad enough to cover the variations that competitors will try in order to work around it. He had Curtis, the lawyer, review the language twice. Curtis made 11 changes. Edward accepted 9 of them and argued the other 2 until Curtis agreed that Edward's version was more accurate, which Curtis did with the expression of a man who is being corrected on legal language by a machinist and finding it professionally uncomfortable. Oscar returns Thursday with a receipt and a filing date. The patent examiner, Oscar reports, looked at the magneto-ignition drawings for a long time and asked 2 technical questions. Oscar answered both. The examiner said the application appeared complete and examination would proceed. 3 weeks, approximately. The certificate arrives on a Tuesday. Edward opens the envelope at the St. Antoine workbench with a piston in his other hand because he was in the middle of an inspection and put it down for this and will pick it back up when he is done. The certificate is 1 page, government printed, with a seal and a number and a formal block of text describing the invention in the compressed, effectless language of legal documents. At the bottom of the description block, in standard type, the same size as every other word on the page, inventor, Edward Danforth, Detroit, Michigan. He reads his name twice, sets the certificate on the clean corner of the bench where it won't pick up oil, picks up the piston and finishes the inspection. Oscar, watching from across the room, says nothing. He has the expression he wears when he considers something to be both significant and adequately handled. The old foundry on Gradiot Avenue has been empty for 14 months. The owner, a man named Prescott, put his money into a speculative iron contract in 1878 that collapsed when the railroad expansion slowed, and the foundry went with it. The building is 800 square meters of brick and iron, high-ceiling concrete floor, a row of north-facing skylights that give the kind of diffuse, even light that is good for precision work, 3 loading doors on the east wall, wide enough for freight wagons, a small office in the northwest corner with a window that looks out onto the main floor, which is where Edward will work when he is not on the floor, which will not be often. Prescott wants $100 a month. Edward offers $65. They settle at $80. Edward signs a 12-month lease, which commits him to $960 and leaves him $240 from the $1,200 he has. He looks at the number for a moment after signing, $240 between where he is and where everything stops. Enough for 1 month of wages, materials for perhaps 40 engines, and nothing else. He hires 26 workers in the first 2 weeks, bringing the total to 34, including the 8 from St. Antoine. He does not hire for experience. Primarily, experience is useful, but it comes with habits, and the habits of men trained in other workshops are usually the habits of other workshops. He hires for hands. He watches each candidate do one task, file a flat surface, cut a thread, fit a bearing, and he hires the ones whose hands know what they are doing, even when their mouths are explaining why they don't. The production line he designs for the Gradiot factory is different from St. Antoine in scale, but the same in principle extended. 12 stations instead of 7. The parts move on a wooden rail, 2 parallel tracks set into the bench at shoulder width, with small wooden sledges that the parts assemblies sit on and are pushed from station to station by hand. It is not mechanical. It does not need to be mechanical yet. What it needs to be is consistent, and the rail enforces consistency by making each station the same distance from the next and giving each worker a fixed space with fixed tools in fixed positions. The first morning with the full line running, a worker named Gerald, large man, steady hands, assigned to Station 4, which is crankshaft bearing installation, looks at the rail and the sledge and then looks at Edward and says, "Are we part of the machine?" "Yes," Edward says. "Be proud of it." Gerald considers this, apparently decides it is an acceptable answer. He goes back to his bearing installation. By the end of week 1, output is 11 engines, week 2, 15, week 3, 18, week 4, 21. Edward tracks the number each Friday on the same page of the same notebook, a column of figures that shows in simple arithmetic what happens when you stop treating production as a craft and start treating it as a system. The craft is still there. It is at the design stage, where it belongs, where Oscar and Edward put in the precision that the production line then reproduces at volume. But the production itself is a machine, and machines run faster than craftsmen. Oscar watches the week 4 number go up on the notebook page and says 21. Yes, 4 weeks ago it was 4. Yes. Oscar closes his own notebook. He has been running an independent count, which Edward expected, and which is why he has never mentioned Oscar's notebook. I was wrong about the line, Oscar says. You were right that it wouldn't work on engines. It works differently on engines, slower to start. The tolerances require more inspection at each station, but it works. It works, Oscar agrees. This is Oscar's version of a complete reversal of position. Murphy runs the article on a Thursday in October. It is not 4 lines on the back page. It is half of page 3, with a sketch of the Gradiate factory floor that a newspaper artist made by visiting the building and drawing what he saw, and a description of the production process that is accurate in the general sense and wrong in several technical specifics that Edward would correct if anyone asked him, which no one has. The headline is, Detroit Mechanic Builds Factory for Horseless Carriages. The subheadline, Danforth Engines, now sold Direct City's future transportation, takes shape. Edward reads it at his desk in the factory office. The article uses his name 11 times. 11, he counts them. The article moves. The Chicago Tribune picks it up and runs a shortened version 4 days later. A Boston paper runs it the week after that. A New York commercial journal reprints the production line section with a note calling it a novel application of Arsenal manufacturing principles to civilian transport. Edward reads each reprint as it arrives, brought by Curtis, the lawyer who has started clipping them, and he notes in his notebook which cities have responded and which industries the responding publications serve. 3 weeks after the Murphy article, the Detroit Courier runs a half-page advertisement. Edward sees it on the way to work, displayed in a newsstand window, and stops to read it from the sidewalk. Danforth Stables, a new chapter. For 40 years, the Danforth name has represented the finest in Michigan transportation. Today, Danforth Stables proudly announces the opening of our mechanical carriage division, bringing the same Danforth commitment to quality and progress into the modern era. Danforth, where tradition meets tomorrow. The Danforth Sun and Horseshoe mark is at the top. The name is in the largest type on the page. The address of the new mechanical division is the same address as the East Stable on Brush Street, 3 blocks from the shed, where all of this started. Edward stands on the sidewalk and reads the advertisement twice. Then he does something he has not done in a long time. He smiles. Not the small, controlled expression he uses when a calculation comes out right. A real smile, brief and unguarded, there for a moment, and then gone. They are afraid. That is what this advertisement means. Virginia Danforth does not advertise out of enthusiasm. She advertises when she feels a position being threatened and needs to defend it publicly before it erodes. The mechanical carriage division almost certainly does not exist yet. It is a claim staked on paper to occupy ground before someone else does. She is planting a flag on a hill she has not climbed. He continues to the factory. The carriage arrives at the Gradiate factory gate at 4 in the afternoon, while Edward is on the production floor checking the week's output against the target. A worker comes to tell him there's a man at the gate who asked for him by name. Edward wipes his hands and goes out. The man is 50, perhaps 55, in a coat that costs more than most of Edward's workers earn in 2 months. Well-fed face, careful eyes, the posture of a man who sits in meetings and wins them. His carriage, a 4-seat Landau black, no identifying marks, is behind him with a driver, who is looking at the factory building with professional blankness. Mr. Danforth, the man says, my name is Cornelius Haynes. I represent a consortium of transportation companies operating on the eastern seaboard. He pauses, with the timing of a man who is used to his own pauses carrying weight. We would very much like to discuss a cooperative arrangement. Edward looks at him. Haynes looks back with the patient, slightly elevated expression of a man who is accustomed to people being glad he came to see them. Come inside, Edward says. He takes one more look at the factory floor before he follows Haynes into the office. 34 workers, 12 stations, 20 engines in various stages of completion on the line. $3,200 in the account, 1 patent, Ferrari's lawyers sending letters that Curtis handles, and Charles Danforth, who has been silent for 2 months, which is the thing on this list that actually requires attention. He closes the office door and sits down across from Cornelius Haynes and waits to hear what cooperation means to a man who arrives in an unmarked carriage. Haynes sits in the factory office with his coat still on and his hat on his knee, in the particular stillness of a man who has sat in many rooms and learned that stillness reads as authority. $10,000, he says, for the patent and a written agreement to exit the engine manufacturing business for a period of not less than 15 years. He pauses. That is a significant sum for a man in your current position. Edward looks at him. The office window behind Haynes shows the factory floor. 27 engines in various stages on the line, the workers at their stations, the wooden sledges moving left to right along the rail. He has been watching that floor for the past 6 months, and the sight of it still does the same thing to him that it did the first week, which is that it looks exactly like what he calculated it would look like, and calculations that come true are satisfying in a way that is difficult to explain to people who have not spent their lives making them. No, Edward says. Haynes does not change expression. The consortium I represent controls freight and passenger transport on the eastern seaboard, 14 companies, combined revenue in excess of $9 million annually. We have relationships with every major bank between here and Boston, with 3 members of the Senate Commerce Committee, and with the principal suppliers of steel stock in Pennsylvania and Ohio. He says this without heat, the way a man states a column of figures. What you're building is genuinely impressive, Mr. Danforth. But impressive things get stopped all the time when they threaten the right interests. Is that a threat? It's a description of how commerce works. Haynes puts his hat on. I'm offering you $10,000 to avoid a situation that will be considerably more expensive than $10,000 for everyone involved. That's not a threat. It's arithmetic. Then here's my arithmetic, Edward says. You have 14 companies and $9 million in annual revenue. The reason you're in this office offering me $10,000 for a patent is that you've calculated what your revenue looks like in 10 years, if the technology I'm building becomes standard. Whatever that number is, it's larger than $10,000, considerably larger. He stands. So the answer is no, thank you for coming. Haynes stands. Looks at Edward with the expression of a man who has arrived at a new assessment. I hope you'll reconsider before the situation becomes more complicated. I'll see you out, Edward says. He watches Haynes's carriage leave from the factory gate. Then he goes back inside and finds Oscar at Station 3, checking a crankshaft bearing. Well, Oscar says without looking up, he wanted to buy the patent and close us down for 15 years, $10,000. Oscar is quiet for a moment. That's a real offer, from real people. Yes. Not Charles playing with matches, adults with Senate connections and steel suppliers. Yes. Oscar sets the bearing down and looks at Edward directly. We need to understand something. Charles is a boy with a grudge and money he didn't earn. He's dangerous the way an untrained dog is dangerous, unpredictably and without strategy. Haynes is different. Haynes has a strategy and the means to execute it, and he's already told you what it is. He picks the bearing back up. We should take that seriously. I'm taking it seriously, Edward says. I'm just not stopping. The first pressure arrives 11 days later. Kowalski Metals on Gratiot, which has been supplying Edward's steel stock since the St. Antoine days, sends a letter explaining that due to contractual obligations with existing customers, they are temporarily unable to fulfill new orders. Edward calls on Kowalski personally. Kowalski will not meet with him. His foreman apologetically explains that Kowalski's largest account has indicated a preference that Kowalski not supply certain other operations. The foreman does not name the account. He doesn't need to. Edward finds an alternate supplier in Toledo within 3 days, more expensive by 14%, delivery by rail adding 2 days to lead time. He adjusts the production schedule to account for the longer lead time and absorbs the cost increase by raising the per-engine price by $8, which his current order backlog will bear. The second metal supplier raises prices without explanation the following week. Edward has been expecting this. He has already written to a foundry in Pittsburgh that he has been watching for 6 months. Larger operation, better capacity, has been looking for new accounts since one of their railroad clients reduced orders. He sends the letter. He receives a favorable reply within a week. The city fire inspector arrives on a Wednesday with a clipboard and an expression of bureaucratic regret. 3 violations. Inadequate clearance between combustible storage and the foundry access. Insufficient number of water buckets on the east wall. Exit pathway on the south side partially obstructed. Correction required within 5 days, or operations must cease pending full compliance review. Edward walks the inspector through the building personally. 2 of the 3 violations are real. He has been meaning to address the storage clearance issue for 2 months, and the south exit pathway has been encroached by a materials delivery that was never properly repositioned. The water bucket count is the inspector's interpretation of the code applied at maximum stringency, which is technically defensible and practically unusual. He corrects all 3 violations in 4 days. The inspector returns, inspects, issues a compliance certificate. The bank rejection comes Friday. The Detroit City Savings Bank, where Edward has maintained an account for 2 years and where he applied for a $3,000 credit line to fund expanded materials purchasing, sends a letter stating that after review the application does not meet their current lending criteria. The letter is signed by the assistant manager, not the manager, which means the decision was made above the level of the person who signed it. Haynes moves slowly, Oscar says when Edward shows him the letter that evening. This is 4 weeks of pressure, nothing catastrophic, everything just slightly harder than it should be. He's not trying to destroy us quickly, Edward says. He's trying to make us expensive enough that the numbers stop working. Is it working? Edward does the current accounting out loud. Steel supply, resolved, higher cost. Credit line, rejected, manageable without it for now. Inspection, cleared. No, he says. Not yet. He pauses. Charles is the one I'm watching. Charles has been silent for 10 weeks. The fire starts at 2:30 in the morning on a Thursday in November. Edward is not at the factory. He is at the Monroe Street rooms he rents now 3 blocks from the Gratiot building, because working until midnight and walking home at 12:30 has become the rhythm. and it is close enough to be sensible. He smells the smoke from the street before he sees the light, and he knows immediately what it is and where it is. The way you know a sound you have been waiting for without admitting you were waiting for it. The warehouse section is the southeast corner of the factory building, separated from the main floor by a brick internal wall, with 2 connecting doorways, used for finished engine storage and material stock. The fire is in that corner, fully established when Edward arrives, the 2 high windows orange and the roof above them already beginning to go. The main building wall is brick, and the connecting doorways have iron doors that someone, probably whoever set the fire, has left open, which is why the heat and smoke are reaching the main floor, but the fire itself has not crossed yet. Edward goes through the main entrance. The smoke is heavy but passable near the floor. He gets to the first connecting doorway and looks through. The warehouse is not savable. 40 finished engines on the storage shelves, 6 weeks of steel stock on the materials pallets, a secondary workbench with tooling, all of it burning, or about to burn. He closes the iron door, goes to the second connecting doorway and closes that one too. Then he walks the main floor. 12 stations, all the production tooling, the lathes, the milling machine, the grinding wheels. He checks each station by touch in the smoke and darkness. Everything solid, everything intact. The fire is in the warehouse. The warehouse has an iron door between it and here. He goes outside and waits for the fire brigade. The warehouse burns for 2 hours. The main building stands. When the sun comes up, the warehouse section is a gutted shell with iron roof beams visible through where the roof was. The main factory floor, untouched. The fire brigade captain, walking the perimeter with Edward at 6 in the morning, finds an accelerant trail along the outside of the warehouse wall. Lamp oil, he thinks, from the smell and the burn pattern. He files a report indicating probable arson. He is professionally regretful about what that means in practical terms. The detective assigned to the case speaks to Edward for 40 minutes, takes notes, and explains that without witnesses or direct physical evidence linking a specific individual to the scene, investigation will be limited. He is a competent man doing a job in a city where the competent thing is to be realistic about what investigations of this kind produce when the people who might be responsible are named Danforth and live on the right side of town. Edward thanks him and goes to the factory floor. Damage accounting. 40 engines destroyed, value approximately $2,000 at production cost. Material stock, $800. Warehouse structure itself, city building, Prescott's problem under the lease. Total Edward's loss, $2,800. Current account balance, $400. He writes these numbers in his notebook, looks at them, closes the notebook. He asks Thomas to assemble the workers on the main floor at 7 o'clock. All 34 of them, including the 7 who had the night shift off and have come in after hearing about the fire. He stands in front of them and looks at them for a moment before he speaks. You know what happened? The warehouse is gone. The floor is not. Every lathe, every station, every tool on this line is exactly where it was yesterday. He pauses. I have $400 and 12 outstanding orders with full prepayment received. Payroll is due in 5 days. I cannot cover it from what's in the account. He looks at the line. Anyone who needs to leave, I understand. You'll receive what's owed to you now. He names a number. Anyone who stays through the end of next month will receive their wages plus a full share of the net margin on the 12 outstanding orders. Not a bonus, a share. The same calculation I use. He waits. 7 men leave. He pays each of them at the office desk while the others wait. It takes 20 minutes. He shakes each man's hand. 27 workers remain on the floor. He goes back out to them and says, we start at 8. Station 2 is down a piston fitting tool. Thomas, find the spare in the lower cabinet. Everyone else, normal rotation. He goes back to the office and picks up his hat. Friedrich Brandt is at his carriage works at 7:30, as he always is, because German carriage makers open early and Brandt has not deviated from this in 30 years. He looks up when Edward walks in. I heard about the fire, Brandt says. I need warehouse space immediately. I know you have the Monroe Street building empty. Brandt leans back in his chair and puts his thumbs in his vest pockets, which is his posture for negotiation. 20% of the first profitable month's margin. 15. 18, 17, and I repair the Monroe Street building's roof, which needs it. Brandt looks at him for a moment. Then he takes his thumbs out of his vest pockets and extends one hand. 17 and the roof, he says. Edward goes to the free press after that. Murphy is at his desk, as he always is before 9 in the morning because newspapers don't wait for reasonable hours. Edward sits down across from him and explains what happened. Not all of it. He says the warehouse was destroyed in a fire that the fire brigade has determined was deliberately set. He says, this is the second deliberate fire targeting the Danforth workshop in 18 months. He says that in his view, established transportation interests that stand to lose significant business to mechanical carriage technology are responsible for a pattern of obstruction that now includes arson. He does not say Charles Danforth. He does not need to. Murphy knows the name on the East Side stable and the name on the patent and can read the distance between them. Murphy asks 3 questions. Edward answers 2 of them. The third, who specifically, he says he has no direct evidence to name. Murphy writes this down. The article runs Friday morning. By Monday, 3 letters have arrived at the factory. A hardware merchant on Jefferson Avenue, a grain shipper with a fleet account, and a physician who already owns one of the first-generation vehicles and wants 2 of the new ones. All three mention the article. All three include payment in advance, $1,400 cash. Edward puts it in the account beside the $400 that remained, $1,800 total. Monroe Street warehouse leased. Production floor intact. 27 workers at their stations, 12 outstanding orders plus 3 new ones. He stands at the office window and looks at the floor. The wooden sledges are moving left to right along the rail, station to station, the way they always move. Station 1 to station 12, part becoming engine, material becoming product, the line running as it ran yesterday and will run tomorrow. They burned his warehouse. The line is still running. He writes the new account balance in the notebook. Below it, in the same handwriting, a note to himself: second building, dedicated production, fireproof construction, watchman on nights. Below that, Charles has moved from knives to fire. Next will be something else. Prepare accordingly. He closes the notebook and goes back to the floor. 1 factory is a workshop with ambitions. 2 factories is a system. 3 factories is something that cannot be easily stopped. Edward writes this in his notebook not as a philosophy, but as a production target. The way he writes everything, as a thing to be built toward with specific steps and specific costs. He has 1 factory. He needs 2 more. The question is not whether, but in what order and at what cost and from what capital base. The Gratiot factory is running 23 engines per week when he starts designing the second building. He has 12 patents now, filed at intervals over the past 2 years, each one covering a specific improvement or system component: the magneto ignition, the water cooling circuit, the valve timing mechanism, the 3-cylinder firing sequence. 12 patents means 12 legal perimeters around 12 pieces of the technology. Anyone who wants to build a competitive engine has to either invent their way around all 12 or come to Edward for a license. So far, nobody has invented around any of them. 2 companies have asked about licenses. He has not responded yet. The second factory goes up on a lot he buys on East Ferry Street. Not rents, buys because he has $22,000 in the account and land in the industrial quarter is selling at prices that will not stay low. The building is new construction. Brick. 1 story, 1,400 square meters, fireproof, which is not incidental. A night watchman from the first week, which is also not incidental. He designs the 4th generation engine while the building is under construction, working in the Gratiot office in the mornings before the floor opens. 4 cylinders. The firing order is the key problem. 4 cylinders can be arranged to almost entirely eliminate the vibration that 3 cylinders only reduces if the firing sequence is correct, which requires the crankshaft throws to be offset at 90-degree intervals, and the valve timing to coordinate across all 4 cylinders simultaneously. He fills 40 pages of notebook with calculations before he draws a single physical component. Oscar sits across from him at the Gratiot office desk on the 3rd morning of this and watches him work through the crankshaft geometry. He does not interrupt. At the end of an hour, when Edward sets the pencil down and looks at what he has, Oscar picks up the notebook and reads the calculation page. He reads it for a long time. The firing balance is perfect, Oscar says. If the crankshaft tolerances hold, I'll hold the crankshaft tolerances. Oscar sets the notebook down. He looks at Edward with the particular expression he has when he is about to say something he does not say often. This is brilliant, Edward. Edward picks up the pencil. The cooling jacket on cylinder 3 is the problem I haven't solved yet. I know, but what's on these pages is brilliant. He stands up. I'll start on the crankshaft drawings this afternoon. This is the longest unambiguous compliment Oscar has offered in 4 years of working together. Edward notes it and returns to the cooling jacket. The Ferry Street factory automation is a different scale from Gratiot. He has watched the Gratiot line long enough to know where the friction is, where work slows, where inspections bunch up, where a human decision is being made that a mechanical check could make faster and more consistently. The Ferry Street line has 16 stations instead of 12. The parts move on a continuous belt driven by a single central motor, a steam engine in the basement, belts running up through the floor to an overhead shaft that drives the production belt and every machine on the floor simultaneously. When the motor runs, everything moves. When the motor stops, everything stops together. The workers do not push sledges. They stand at their stations and the work comes to them. Oscar watches the belt run the first morning of full operation, the components moving steadily from station 1 towards station 16, and does not say anything for a full 2 minutes. Then, it's a loom. It's a loom that makes engines. The textile men have been doing this for 40 years. Yes, and nobody applied it to precision metalwork because precision metalwork men thought they were different from textile men. Edward watches a crankshaft assembly move from station 7 to station 8. They're not different. The principle is the same. Break the work into steps. Move the work through the steps. The hands at each step do one thing until they do it perfectly. And when one station falls behind, the belt waits for no one. If a station falls behind, the line manager rebalances. That's what he's for. Edward looks at Oscar. You're going to tell me it won't work? I was going to tell you the intake valve inspection at station 11 needs a second operator during the first month while people learn the rhythm. Oscar crosses his arms. But the rest of it will work. The Ferry Street factory produces 40 engines in its first full week of operation. The Gratiot factory produces 23. Combined weekly output, 63 engines, against a backlog of orders that currently stands at 418. The third factory takes 11 months to build and occupies a full city block on the north side of Gratiot, 2 blocks from the original building that started everything. It is the largest private manufacturing facility in Detroit and possibly in Michigan. The concept is simple and had never been done for automotive production anywhere in the country. Raw material enters at the west end, and a complete operable vehicle exits at the east end. Steel stock goes in. Engines are built in the engine hall. Frames are fabricated in the frame shop. Bodies are constructed in the coachwork section. Edward has hired 12 of the best carriage builders in the city, men who have been building wooden and leather bodies for 20 years, and is paying them considerably more than carriage work pays. Wheels, tires, fittings, leather, glass, all sourced, delivered to the building, installed on the assembly floor. The vehicle rolls out the east door complete. The day the third factory produces its first complete vehicle, a 4-seat touring car with the 4th-generation engine, dark blue body, brass fittings, the Danforth name on the dashboard panel in raised steel letters. Edward walks alongside it as it moves on the final assembly track from the last station to the exit door. He watches the east door open. He watches the vehicle roll out into the daylight on its own wheels, engine idling. He does not make a speech. He goes back inside and checks Station 14, which has been running slightly slow all week. The Ferrari factory closure is reported in the Free Press on a Wednesday. Half a column, business section, factual and brief. The Ferrari Carriage and Motor Works on East Jefferson has ceased operations following the departure of its principal investor and the failure to secure financing for continued production. The vehicles produced under the Ferrari name, powered by first-generation Danforth engines, had found declining market acceptance as newer engine technology became available. Antonio Ferrari has returned to Italy. The Jefferson Avenue facility will be sold at auction. A letter arrives at the Gratiot office 3 weeks later, postmarked Genoa. The handwriting on the envelope is precise and European. Edward opens it at his desk. The letter is 1 paragraph. Antonio Ferrari writes that he has been thinking about their arrangement for some time and has reached the conclusion that he made a fundamental error. He believed that a man who builds things can be separated from what he builds and made into a supplier. He understands now that this was wrong. A man who invents is not a component. He wishes Edward well. He signs it with his full name. Edward reads the letter twice. He folds it and opens the bottom drawer of his desk and puts it in the back, behind the folder with the lease agreements and the original patent certificate. He closes the drawer. He sits for a moment. Then he opens the top drawer, which is where he keeps the photograph of his mother in the silver frame. He moved it from the workbench to the desk when the desk became where he spends his mornings, because this is where he does his best thinking, and she should be in the room where he does his best thinking. He looks at the photograph for a moment. Then he goes back to work. The Danforth Stables freight contracts begin disappearing in the spring. Farmers who have been paying stable rates for horse-drawn delivery are purchasing Danforth vehicles for their own use. The calculation is simple enough that anyone with a ledger can do it. A horse requires feed, shoeing, veterinary care, stable labor. A mechanical vehicle requires fuel and occasional maintenance. The break-even point, at current vehicle prices and fuel costs, is approximately 14 months. After 14 months, the vehicle is cheaper. Every farmer in Michigan can do that arithmetic. The Postal Service transitions 3 of its eastern routes to mechanical vehicles. The Army contract for horse supply, 16 stations. The original business Edward's father built is under review. Charles is 16 years old. He has been watching the stables shrink the way a man watches a tide go out, unable to stop it, increasingly certain of what the receding water will reveal. He hires a machinist from Toledo who claims to understand the Danforth 4th-generation engine. The machinist builds something in the maintenance shed behind the east stable for 6 weeks. When he runs it, the fuel mixture ignites improperly under compression and the force vents through the valve cover in a way that destroys the test assembly, breaks 3 windows in the adjacent building, and ends the machinist's employment immediately. Nobody is hurt. The machinist is paid and dismissed. Charles goes to his mother. Virginia Danforth listens to the account of the Toledo machinist and the broken windows with the expression she wears when she is deciding not to show what she is feeling. Then she says, "Charles, stop fighting him with your hands. You're not an engineer. Find a lawyer." The lawsuit is filed 2 weeks later. The claim prepared by Clement and Howe asserts that Edward Danforth's use of the Danforth name in commerce creates a false impression of association with Danforth Stables, constituting unfair trade practice and reputational harm to an established business. Edward reads the complaint in Curtis's office. He gets to the core claim and stops, reads it again. Then he does something that surprises Curtis, who has known Edward for 4 years and has never seen him do it. He laughs. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind that takes a moment to subside. "They want to take my name," he says, when it passes. "The name they threw away when they threw me out." Curtis explains the legal position in 2 sentences. Edward Danforth was born. Edward Danforth. He has a birth certificate, a baptismal record, and 27 years of documented existence under that name. The claim has no foundation. Clement and Howe know it has no foundation. They filed it anyway, either because Charles pushed them to or because they calculated that the cost of defending it would be a nuisance Edward might pay to avoid. "How long to resolve it?" Edward asks. "If we respond immediately and completely, 2 weeks, possibly 3. Respond immediately and completely." The court finds in Edward's favor 17 days later. The judgment is 2 paragraphs. Edward Danforth is the legal bearer of the name Danforth by right of birth. No commercial restriction applies. Edward files the judgment in the same drawer as the Ferrari letter. The accounting at the close of that month: 3 factories, 340 workers, 12 patents, 63 engines produced weekly, 114 complete vehicles sold in the past quarter. Cash on hand, $28,000. Haynes has been quiet for 4 months. Quiet from Haynes means the same thing as quiet from Charles. Not absence of intention, but change of method. Charles is not quiet. He is at his mother's desk at the East Stable, going through the books with the expression of a 16-year-old who is learning for the first time and all at once what it means when the numbers in a ledger move the wrong direction for long enough. Virginia stands behind him and looks at the same numbers and says nothing. Outside the East Stable, 3 blocks away, the overnight shift at the Graciette factory is running. The belt is moving, the stations are lit. The 4th-generation engines are moving from Station 1 to Station 16, one step at a time, the way they have moved every night for the past 8 months. $28,000, 3 factories, 340 people whose wages depend on the line running. Edward writes in his notebook before he sleeps. Haynes, 4 months silent. Reason unknown. Investigate. Below that, Station 14. Still slow, fixed Thursday. He closes the notebook and turns off the lamp. Captain Elias West arrives at the Graciette factory on a Tuesday morning in a government-issue carriage with no identifying markings except the quality of the horses, which are Army stock and recognizable to anyone who has spent time around military procurement. He is 45 lean, with the economical posture of a man who has spent years in conditions where carrying unnecessary weight is a liability. He asks for Edward by name at the gate, gives his own name and rank without elaboration, and waits. Edward comes out to meet him on the floor rather than the office, because he has learned that men who visit factories have their real reactions on the floor, not in chairs. West walks the length of the production line without speaking, looking at each station with the focused attention of a man conducting an inspection rather than a tour. He stops at Station 9, which is the Magneto Assembly Station, and looks at the work for 30 seconds longer than he looks at anything else. In the office, he sits down and says, "The Army is developing a program for aerial reconnaissance vehicles. The Wright brothers demonstrated the principle 4 years ago. We have aircraft. What we do not have is an engine that meets military operational requirements." He pauses. "Your 4th-generation engine is the best power plant currently produced in this country. We need a version of it that will operate at altitude, at sustained load, in conditions your automotive application doesn't encounter." "What are the weight requirements?" Edward asks. "Gross engine weight not to exceed 180 pounds, output not less than 60 horsepower, sustained operation at full load for not less than 2 hours without mechanical failure." Edward does the arithmetic immediately, because arithmetic is how he processes new information. His 4th-generation automotive engine produces 62 horsepower and weighs 340 pounds. Getting from 340 pounds to 180 pounds at the same power output is not an incremental improvement. It is a different engine. "What's the timeline?" he asks. "The Army wants a working prototype within 12 months. Production contract for 100 units annually pending successful prototype evaluation. And the terms?" West puts a document on the desk. Edward reads it. The terms are what he expected and do not want. Production facility to be constructed on government-designated land, subject to Army inspection at any time. Output exclusively for military use. All design documentation to be held in joint custody with the War Department. "No," Edward says. West looks at him without visible surprise. He has the expression of a man who expected this answer and prepared for it. "The civilian production stays separate," Edward says. "Independent legal entity, independent facility, no Army access. The military program gets a dedicated factory on a site I select, and that factory produces exclusively for the Army contract. The Army receives engines, not technology. Design documentation stays with me. If the Army wants to terminate the contract, all tooling and documentation revert to my ownership. The War Department will want joint custody of the design. The War Department can want whatever it likes. You came to me because I have the best engine in the country. If you want a different arrangement, find a different engine." He pauses. "You won't find one, which is why you're here." West looks at the document on the desk for a moment. Then he picks it up and puts it back in his coat. "I'll need to consult with my superiors 3 days. Take the time you need." West returns on Friday with a revised document. The joint custody clause is replaced with a licensing arrangement. The Army holds a non-exclusive license to the design for military applications. Edward retains full ownership. The facility site is subject to mutual agreement, all other terms substantially as discussed. Edward reads it twice, signs it. West shakes his hand across the desk with the grip of a man who has just concluded a transaction he is satisfied with and says, 12 months, Mr. Danforth. 11, Edward says. "I'll have the prototype in 11. West leaves. Edward sits for a moment and then opens his notebook to a fresh page and writes at the top, aviation engine. Below that he writes the target, 180 pounds, 60 horsepower, 2 hours sustained. Then he draws a line and writes below it, How? He works on the how for 2 weeks before he touches metal. The automotive engine is cast iron throughout. Block, heads, crank. Cast iron is strong, cheap, easily machined to precise tolerances, and heavy in the specific way that does not matter when the engine sits on a vehicle frame on the ground. In the air, every pound is a problem. The question is what replaces cast iron at the structural locations where strength cannot be compromised. Oscar arrives each morning and they work through the drawings together, which means Oscar sits across the desk and asks questions in the form of statements, and Edward answers them by revising the drawing. This has been their working method for 4 years, and it is faster than most collaboration Edward has seen, because neither of them wastes time on courtesy when the engineering is wrong. The block walls, Oscar says on the third morning, you're keeping them at standard automotive thickness. For now, you can't. At standard thickness, the aluminum doesn't save enough weight. You need to go thinner. Thinner aluminum under combustion pressure will crack. At automotive thickness, yes. With ribbing, no. Oscar takes the pencil and sketches on the margin of the drawing, a cross-section of the cylinder wall with external ribs running longitudinally. The rib carries the longitudinal stress. The wall carries the radial pressure. You split the load paths. Edward looks at the sketch, looks at his own drawing, takes the pencil back and begins modifying the block design. Aluminum is the argument that takes the longest. Edward has been using aluminum for small components, brackets, covers, non-structural housings for 2 years because aluminum is a third the weight of iron and adequate for parts that don't carry primary loads. Nobody has cast an engine block in aluminum. The material is expensive. Its casting behavior is different from iron in ways that require different mold geometry and different pouring temperatures, and its behavior under the thermal cycling of a running engine, expansion, contraction, the stress of repeated heating and cooling, is not fully understood at the dimensions of an engine block. Edward understands it well enough to know that it will work if the wall thickness and ribbing geometry are correct, and that finding the correct geometry requires building something and running it until it either holds or fails. First, aluminum block, poured at the foundry on the 3rd floor of the Gradiate building. Using a wooden pattern, Edward made himself over 3 evenings. It comes out of the mold with a clean surface and correct dimensions. He machines it, assembles the engine, runs it on the test stand at full load. At 47 minutes, the block develops a crack along the lower left cylinder bore. The crack is where Oscar said it would be if the ribbing was insufficient, which Oscar did not say until after the crack appeared, because Oscar has the self-discipline not to predict failures he isn't certain of. Edward examines the crack, measures it, looks at the stress pattern, redesigns the rib geometry, increasing the cross-section at the base where the crack initiated, makes a new pattern, pours a second block. Second block runs for 3 hours and 20 minutes at full load before he shuts it down intentionally. No cracks, no distortion, bearing temperatures within acceptable range throughout. He disassembles the engine and inspects every component. The aluminum shows heat marking at the expected locations, consistent with the thermal model. Nothing unexpected. He makes a third block with minor refinements to the cooling jacket geometry, runs it for 6 hours, then for 12. Then for 20 continuous hours on the test stand, which requires Edward and Oscar to run shifts, because one of them needs to be present and monitoring at all times, and 20 hours is too long for one person to maintain useful attention. At hour 19, Oscar is sitting on a stool beside the test stand, reading a technical journal when Edward comes in to take over. Oscar does not look up from the journal. 0 anomalies, he said. Bearing temperatures have been stable for the last 8 hours. Oil pressure has not varied by more than 2%. Edward looks at the engine running, listens to it. The sound of the aluminum block engine is different from the iron block version in a way that is subtle but consistent, slightly higher in pitch, a cleaner harmonic, the mechanical signature of a structure that is vibrating at its natural frequency rather than being damped by mass. He stands and listens to it for a moment. Shut it down at 20, he says. Yes, Oscar says, and turns a page. The aviation factory goes up on a parcel of land on the east side of the city, separate from the 3 Gratiot area facilities, with a fence and a gate and a sign that says Danforth Aviation Works. Restricted access. The building is smaller than any of the automotive facilities, 400 square meters, precision-oriented rather than volume-oriented. The tolerances on aviation components are 10 times tighter than automotive production standards. Every dimension is checked twice by 2 different people, with 2 different instruments. Components that fail inspection are destroyed, not regraded. Edward selects 20 mechanics from the 3 automotive factories, the best hands in each facility, the ones Thomas and Marcus and Joseph identify when Edward asks them to name who they would trust with work that cannot be wrong. He tells each of the 20 what the work is and what it requires. 18 accept. He hires 2 from outside to fill the remaining positions, both trained on scientific instruments. Oscar runs the aviation floor. He does not ask for this, and Edward does not formally offer it. Edward simply says one morning at the Gratiot office, West wants the prototype in 11 months. I need someone on the aviation floor who won't let the tolerances slip. He looks at Oscar. I'm going to be splitting time across 4 facilities. I can't be there every day. Oscar says, 14 months ago you told me the production line would triple output. I said it wouldn't work on engines. He picks up his coat. I'll start Monday. The prototype engine is installed in an Army biplane on a clear morning in October, 11 months and 4 days after the contract signing. The airframe is the Army's, a 2-seat reconnaissance design with a forward engine mount and a pusher propeller. Edward's engine is bolted to the forward mount by 3 Army mechanics, while Edward and Oscar watch and West stands 20 feet away with his hands clasped behind his back. The test pilot is a young lieutenant named Carver, who has been flying experimental aircraft for 2 years and has the calm, slightly distracted expression of a man whose attention is always partly on something the rest of the room can't see. He walks around the aircraft once, checks the control surfaces, talks to the mechanics briefly, and climbs in. The engine starts on the second pull of the starting cord. Edward listens to it from the ground, the same clean harmonic he knows from the test stand, but changed by the propeller load, deeper and more purposeful. The aircraft taxis to the far end of the field. It takes off in 300 feet. Edward watches it climb. He has calculated the performance numbers, thrust-to-weight ratio, expected climb rate, cruise altitude. The numbers are correct, and the aircraft is doing exactly what the numbers predict, which should not be surprising and is surprising anyway, because numbers on a page and a machine in the sky are different categories of real. The aircraft flies for 42 minutes. It lands on the same field, rolls to a stop 40 feet from where it took off, and Lieutenant Carver climbs out with the expression of a man who has just had a good morning. He walks over to Edward and says, "Smooth, no vibration above 1,000 feet. Power delivery was consistent throughout." He pauses. "It's a good engine." Wes shakes Edward's hand. 100 units annually, he says. "We'll have the production contract to your lawyers by the end of the month." Edward nods. He is looking at the aircraft, not at West. The engine is still running. Carver left it idling. He can hear it from 40 feet away, steady and low, the aluminum block doing what 3 months of test stand hours said it would do. The attack on the steel supply chain begins 6 weeks later, and it begins so gradually that Edward does not identify it as an attack for the first 2 weeks. The Great Lakes Steel Rail Company supplies 60% of the steel stock for the 3 automotive factories. In November, deliveries begin running 2 days late, then 4 days, then a full week behind schedule. The company's representative, when Curtis contacts him, offers logistical explanations: rail congestion, increased demand from other customers, seasonal supply constraints. The explanations are plausible and insufficient, which is a specific combination that Edward has learned to recognize. The Ferry Street factory runs out of steel stock on a Wednesday and shuts down for 3 days. 78 workers standing idle for 3 days costs Edward approximately $400 in wages for work not performed and a further $600 in delayed order fulfillment. He is not immediately certain this is a deliberate action rather than a supply chain failure. He asks Oscar to look into the Great Lakes Steel Rail Company's ownership structure, because Oscar has a talent for following paper trails that Edward has used before and finds more reliable than most commercial intelligence. Oscar brings him a document on Monday morning. He sets it on the desk without comment and waits. The document is a summary of share ownership changes at Great Lakes Steel Rail Company over the past 4 months. 3 months ago, a block of shares representing 11% of the company changed hands through a series of intermediary holding companies, the last of which traces back to an attorney at the firm of Clement and Howe. Clement and Howe, Virginia's firm, Charles's firm. 11% is not majority ownership. It is enough in a company with distributed shareholding to have a loud voice in operational decisions if you know which other shareholders to talk to. It is enough to slow deliveries without leaving a direct fingerprint. Edward looks at the document for a moment. He thinks about his response for 2 days, which is longer than he usually needs because the response has to be both effective and permanent. He buys the Michigan Central Spur Line, a smaller regional rail company that has been operating at marginal profitability for 6 years and whose principal asset is a network of spur lines connecting the industrial east side of Detroit to the main freight routes. Purchase price: $31,000, which reduces his cash position significantly but does not threaten operations. He then spends $8,000 constructing direct rail spur connections from the Michigan Central network to each of his 3 automotive facilities and the aviation works. Steel stock now arrives by rail directly to each factory's loading door, bypassing Great Lakes Steel Rail entirely. The construction takes 6 weeks. When the first steel delivery rolls directly into the Gratiot factory on its own spur line, Edward stands at the loading door and watches it come in. The delivery is on time. The price per ton is lower than Great Lakes was charging. The train is his. Oscar stands beside him watching the steel come off the flat cars. "Expensive solution," he says. "Permanent solution," Edward says. "Charles bought 11% of a steel company to slow my deliveries. I bought a railroad to make his 11% irrelevant. The cost differential will recover in 18 months at current steel consumption. After that, the Michigan Central Spur Line is a profit-generating asset." Oscar looks at the flat cars being unloaded. "And the 11%? Still there. Let him keep it. He paid for shares in a company that no longer supplies us. That's his problem to explain to Virginia." Virginia finds out about the shares within the week. Edward does not know exactly when or how, but the sequence of events makes it reconstructible. The stables have been running thin for 2 years. The ledgers are Virginia's responsibility, and Charles committed stable operating capital to a speculative shareholding in a steel rail company without telling her. When the shareholding fails to produce the intended effect, when the spur lines go in and the steel keeps arriving, the money spent on the shares becomes a visible loss with no corresponding gain. The argument between Virginia and Charles, Edward learns later through Curtis's informal network of commercial informants, is not quiet. It is the first time in Charles's life that his mother has spoken to him the way she speaks to employees who have made expensive mistakes. Charles is 18 years old and has spent 18 years learning that Virginia's approval is a resource in finite supply. He has just spent a significant portion of it. Edward notes this in his notebook under competitive position without particular satisfaction. A crack between Virginia and Charles is useful information. It is not a resolution. Both of them are still there. Both of them are still capable of deciding that the next approach should be different. He closes the notebook, goes back to the aviation works to check on the second prototype engine, which Oscar has been running on the stand for 6 days and which is performing exactly as calculated. He stands in the aviation works doorway for a moment before going in, looking at the city to the west, the smoke from the Gradiette factory chimneys, the Ferry Street building, just visible past the rooftops, the Michigan Central spur line running along the right-of-way he bought 6 weeks ago, 3 automotive factories, 1 aviation works, a railroad. Above all of it, the sky, which is where 100 engines a year will go, starting next spring. He goes inside. The numbers, as of the first week of December, are these: 3 automotive factories, Gradiette, Ferry Street, and the full-cycle facility on the north side. 1 aviation works on the east parcel. 1 railroad, the Michigan Central Spur Line, acquired 6 weeks ago, currently generating modest freight revenue while supplying the factories at cost. 19 patents, the most recent covering the ribbed aluminum block in the aviation magneto timing system. 520 workers across all facilities. Annual revenue, $180,000, of which approximately $41,000 is net margin, after wages, materials, lease obligations, and capital servicing. The Danforth stables, 4 of the original 16 stations closed. The East Side Station, 3 blocks from the original shed on Brush Street, still operates but at reduced capacity. The Army Horse Supply contract, which was the foundation of the business William Danforth built over 30 years, is under final review by the War Department, which has just signed a production contract with Edward for 100 aviation engines annually. Charles Danforth, 18 years old, in debt to the extent of the stable operating capital he committed to the Great Lakes Steel Rail shares, which are now worth less than he paid for them and produce no strategic value. Virginia Danforth managing what remains. Edward learns about the auction on a Thursday from Curtis, who learned about it from the public notice filed with the county clerk's office. The Danforth family estate on the North Road, the house, the grounds, the original stable yard, the woodshed where Edward's first workshop was padlocked when he was 11 years old, is to be sold at public auction on Monday to satisfy creditors. The estate has been pledged as security against stable debts that can no longer be serviced from operating income. He reads the notice once, sets it down, picks it up and reads it again. He tells no one, not Oscar, not Curtis, not Thomas or Marcus, or any of the floor managers. On Monday morning he puts on his good coat, not the working coat, the one he bought 2 years ago for the city council presentation on mechanical vehicle regulation, and he takes a hired carriage to the auction house on Woodward Avenue, and he goes in alone. The room holds perhaps 40 people, buyers, lawyers, creditors, the curious. Edward takes a seat in the middle rows, not the front and not the back, among people he does not know. He keeps his coat on. He does not look at the front of the room immediately. Virginia is standing against the left wall, near the auctioneer's table. She is dressed carefully, the way she has always been dressed carefully, because Virginia has never in Edward's memory allowed external circumstance to be visible in her appearance. Her hair is correct. Her coat is the good one. She is looking at the room with the expression she uses when she is measuring the occupants. She does not see Edward for the first several minutes because he is not where she expects him to be and because she is not expecting him at all. He watches her scan the room twice before her eyes pass over him, and then, on the second pass, stop. He sees the moment she recognizes him. It is small, a stillness that is different from her ordinary stillness. A fraction of a second where the measurement she is conducting stops and something else happens. Then she looks away and does not look at him again. The estate is... Edward sits through 6 preceding lots with his hands in his lap and watches the room function. The bidders, the auctioneer, the rhythm of offers and counter-offers. When Lot 7 is called, and the auctioneer describes the property, Edward listens to the description of a house he grew up in delivered in the flat professional language of real estate inventory. The bidding opens. 2 buyers engage. Edward waits. He lets them find their ceiling, the point where each additional increment requires a decision rather than a reflex. When the bids slow and the auctioneer's voice takes on the slight additional weight that precedes a closing call, Edward raises his hand and names a number. The number is 15% above the current bid, not so high as to be theatrical, high enough that the 2 active bidders look at each other and then at the auctioneer, and then make the calculation that experienced buyers make when someone enters late at a decisive margin. The room is quiet for the required time. The auctioneer's gavel comes down. Edward stands. He buttons his coat. He picks up his hat from his knee. Virginia is still against the left wall. She is looking at him across the room with an expression he has not seen on her before. Not the measuring look, not the dismissal, not the practiced indifference she installed in Charles and used herself for 20 years. Something that has no name and does not need one because it will not be repeated. He walks to her. He stops at a conversational distance and speaks at a volume that carries to her and no further. "Good morning, Virginia. I'm taking back what's mine by right." He pauses. My mother would have been pleased. He puts his hat on, turns, walks to the door. He does not look back. He did not look back when he was 20 years old walking down the porch steps with a suitcase, and he does not look back now, and the consistency of this is not something he planned, but it is something he notices briefly on the street outside, where the hired carriage is waiting. Oscar is at the Ferry Street factory when Edward arrives that afternoon. He is at the grinding wheel, which is his default location when he is thinking about something, because the action of dressing the wheel occupies his hands without occupying his mind. He looks up when Edward comes in and reads the situation from Edward's coat and the time of day. "The estate," Oscar says. "Yes." Oscar considers this. "What are you going to do with it? Put a workshop in it." Oscar looks at him seriously. "No." Edward takes his coat off and hangs it by the door. "But it's a pleasant thought." Oscar turns back to the grinding wheel. After a moment he says, "7 years ago you left that house with a suitcase. $4.30, a suitcase, some drawings, and now." Edward looks at the floor of the Ferry Street factory, the belt running, the stations lit, the fourth-generation engines moving left to right in the way they always move. 63 engines a week from 2 facilities, the Gradiate full-cycle building producing complete vehicles, the aviation works running second prototype tests, 520 people whose wages come from the line running, 3 factories, he says, 1 aviation works, a railroad, 19 patents, the house I grew up in. He pauses. "The Danforth stables are dying. My name is in the newspapers. The army is flying on my engines." He picks up his work coat. "My mother would have been pleased." He goes to the production floor and checks station 14, which has been running 5% below target for 3 weeks, and which he has been meaning to address since the note he wrote 2 months ago, and has not addressed because there has always been something more urgent. He looks at the station, watches Marcus work through 2 cycles, identifies the issue, that the part's presentation angle is wrong, costing a second per cycle, which compounds across the shift, and corrects it in 6 minutes by adjusting the feed rack angle by 8 degrees. 20 engines per week from that one correction, compounded. He writes it in the notebook. The letter from West arrives on Wednesday. It is handwritten, not typed on plain paper rather than War Department letterhead. Edward reads this before he reads the content, because how a letter is written tells you what the writer wants the letter to be. West writes that the aviation engine demonstration has been shown to officials in Washington at a level above his own rank. The response has exceeded what West anticipated. The Army's interest is not 100 engines annually. The number being discussed is 1,000. A facility near Washington, under Army administrative oversight, to supply a program that West is not at liberty to describe fully in writing, but which involves more than reconnaissance. Edward reads this paragraph twice. 1,000 engines. He calculates the production requirements. A facility 4 times the size of the current aviation works. Specialized tooling. A workforce of perhaps 120 in aviation production alone. The contract value at government rates for military procurement would be larger than his current total annual revenue. Then he reads the second paragraph. West writes that he is passing along information as a courtesy that goes beyond his formal role, because he believes Edward should have it. Cornelius Haynes met with Senator Cole of the Senate Commerce Committee 3 weeks ago. The subject of the meeting, which West has from a source he considers reliable, was draft legislation to regulate the production and sale of privately manufactured mechanical vehicles on the grounds of public safety and interstate commerce. The proposed regulatory structure, if enacted, would require federal licensing for vehicle manufacturers, with licensing criteria to be set by a newly created commission. The commission's composition, as discussed in the meeting, would include representatives of existing transportation interests. If the bill passes as described, West writes, the licensing criteria will not be met by any manufacturer who has not been in business for 20 years. The Danforth factories are 8 years old. The bill would close them legally within 6 months of enactment. West's estimate of the timeline to a Senate vote, 3 to 4 months. Edward folds the letter. He stands up from the desk and walks to the office window. Outside, the Gratiot factory floor is running the night shift, the skylights lit from below, the smoke from the exhaust vents rising straight up in the cold air, the sound of the belt and the machinery, a constant low register that he has stopped consciously hearing the way you stop hearing a clock that has been on the wall your whole life. 520 people, 3 automotive facilities, an aviation works, a railroad, 19 patents, 100 engines a year flying for the Army with 1,000 more requests. Haynes has stopped trying to make the business expensive. He has gone to Washington to make it illegal, and the Army wants a factory near Washington under their oversight, which is either a protection or a second trap. And the difference between those two things depends entirely on how the negotiation is conducted and who is in the room. He looks at the factory for a long time. The belt running, the lights, the smoke going straight up. They want control of the sky, which means the fight is no longer in Detroit. The fight is in Washington, in committee rooms and senators' offices, and the legal language of bills that have not yet been drafted. He has spent 8 years learning how metal works. He is going to have to learn how Washington works in 3 months. He goes back to the desk, opens the notebook. At the top of a fresh page, he writes Washington below that. 2 columns. Left column, what he has. Right column, what he needs. He starts filling in the right column. It is a longer list than he would like. He works until the night shift ends and the day shift arrives, and the belt keeps running without interruption. The way it always does, station 1 to station 16. The line that started in a room above a laundry with a piece of gas pipe and a candle, and a man who needed to understand how things worked. He closes the notebook. He will finish the list in the morning.